The happy life of a fun seeker in Marvel. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 501 Stephen, the Muggle-turned-mage. In contrast to Sherlock's calm attitude, Stephen's experience during his initiation was truly thrilling. Unlike the dazzling and colorful portrayals in movies, true initiation was undoubtedly dangerous and mysterious, far more than the simple images of split fingers depicted in the movies. But it made sense. While magic was essentially alone, it was still a ritual that transformed a Muggle into a magical being, and it couldn't be portrayed as effortlessly as in the movies. The squib was ecstatic. Sherlock, though he remained seated behind the coffee table, remained focused on Stephen undergoing his initiation. Of course, he was merely observing, not staring. Although both were Dimension Lords, Sherlock was still a newly minted Dimension Lord. Compared to the Trinity gods like Vishanti, he was still a mere calf. Sherlock would never make things difficult for himself. His so-called attention was merely satisfying his curiosity. As for Stephen, honestly, he had no time to care about what was happening outside. During his enlightenment, Stephen saw countless things he had never known before. He witnessed the origin of the universe, the birth of life, the wars of the ancient gods, countless wonders, and even the shadow of the Lord of the Dimension, loaned to him. He even experienced a similar experience to Michelangelo's creation of Adam, touching the shadow's finger. Miraculously, in the moment of contact, Stephen discovered that the shadow had transformed into his own image. Then, he was stretched to the speed of light and flung away into the distance. Countless secrets, miracles, coincidences, people, history, events, knowledge, and creations from the beginning of the universe to the present appeared before Stephen's eyes like flowing water. Of course, these images were just dreams, flashing before Stephen's eyes for a moment before being forced into oblivion by a mysterious force. After all, the information contained in the image of just the smallest, most inconspicuous spot was enough to make Stephen's head explode. A moment later, Stephen, with a speed as if in slow motion, peacefully lay on the ground. Before Sherlock could inquire if something had gone wrong, Stephen, seemingly remarkably peaceful, suddenly opened his eyes. Like a drowning man emerging from the water, he sat up and began to breathe heavily. Only then did Sherlock realize that Stephen's head was practically soaked with sweat. His thick beard and tangled hair had become limp strands, lying limply on his head. An unfamiliar person, observing Stephen's appearance at this moment, would never have thought he had just undergone a ritual to transform him from a Muggle into a wizard, but would have suspected he had just been pulled from the water. After sitting on the ground for a long moment, Stephen finally managed to catch his breath. He looked at Sherlock and the others, his eyes no longer filled with the disbelief and frenzy he'd previously displayed. He opened his mouth slightly and uttered two words. "Teach me." Upon hearing Stephen's words, the Ancient One's smile deepened. He raised his hand slightly, pointing at Sherlock. "Of course, this wizard Sherlock will be your master from now on. He and I will guide you in your magical training. Now, let Wang and Mordo take you down to rest." Sherlock, upon hearing the Ancient One's words, playfully waved his hand at Stephen, his expression as if he had just discovered a new toy. After the Ancient One finished speaking, Stephen, looking at Sherlock sitting across from him, felt a strange, unsettling feeling. The feeling of foreboding intensified when he saw Sherlock's expression, like a mischievous child discovering a new toy. After hearing the Ancient One's instructions, Mordo looked at Stephen with a look of pity. Wang, on the other hand, looked at Stephen with a look of gloating delight. Of course, their emotions were subtle, unnoticed by Stephen. They moved in unison, one on each side, lifting Stephen off the ground. Stephen, about to say something, was suddenly yanked off the ground by the two men. He immediately tried to claim he could walk on his own, but he quickly realized he had overestimated his own abilities. Even moving his thighs was a struggle, as if the act of rising from the ground had consumed all of Stephen's energy. Seeing Stephen's look of surprise, Mordo paused before offering a soothing reassurance. "Don't worry, this is always the case after your first initiation. I'll find you a room, and you'll recover after a night's rest. There's Wi-Fi in the room, so you can video call your family to let them know you're safe. I'll give you the password." Stephen was filled with questions after hearing Mordo's words. After all, in Stephen's mind, Wi-Fi had nothing to do with magic. It was like Voldemort, munching on a melon, then whipping out a desert eagle. Seeing the expression on Stephen's face, Mordo felt a little helpless. He had seen that expression countless times. Every new mage to Camartage had the same look after hearing his words. As he carried Stephen away, Mordo explained. We're just mages, not primitives. It's perfectly normal for us to use a little technology. After all, technology is definitely more convenient in certain situations. Watching Mordo solemnly explain to Stephen that mages aren't primitives, Wang couldn't hold back his smile. After all, everyone in Camartage knew Mordo was a stern person. It was hard to imagine Mordo, the new student receptionist, always saying these things to the newcomers. It was like catching your stern homeroom teacher secretly performing a dirty joke stand-up show in a backroom theater. Of course, Wang wasn't stupid. In front of him, he restrained himself somewhat, but the result was that his expression twisted and turned red. Seeing Wang's expression, Mordo sighed helplessly. Wang, if you want to laugh, just laugh. Don't hold it back, ho ha ho ho ha ho ha. No, Master Mordo, don't think too much. I just thought of something funny. Ho ha ho ha. After getting Mordo's permission, Wang couldn't hold back his laughter anymore and started laughing heartily. Of course, Stephen, who met the two for the first time, didn't understand why Wang laughed like that, but looking at Wang's forced way of saving face, for some reason, Sherlock's appearance just now suddenly appeared in Stephen's mind. After thinking for a long time, Stephen turned to Mordo and asked seriously. I have a question, Master Mordo, are all the mages in Camartage so naughty? Chapter 502 Wanda's Magic Problem. Unlike the relaxed atmosphere at Stephen's place, Wanda felt extremely embarrassed in Ancient One's room. After all, after Mordo and Wang carried Stephen away, only she, Sherlock, and the unknown female bald wizard who looked very high in status were left in the room. And the worst thing was, why were neither Sherlock nor the wizard talking? Not talking would have been fine, but the unknown bald female wizard kept refilling her teacup. Although Wanda admitted that the tea was delicious and that it was the first time in her life that she had ever tasted such a refreshing tea, she couldn't resist drinking it all the time. Wanda even felt that her stomach was now full of tea. After a while, Sherlock finally spoke to Ancient One. All right, Master Ancient One, stop bullying my young apprentice, who's just embarked on the path of magic. If she keeps drinking like this, she'll probably need to go to the bathroom before we can even resolve her magic problem. After hearing Sherlock's words, the Ancient One hinted at a hint of regret, but he stopped refilling Wanda's glass. Wanda, already feeling somewhat socially anxious at Sherlock's actions, breathed a sigh of relief. Of course, if Wanda had looked up at the Ancient One, she would have seen his eyes filled with a smile and the joy of a successful prank. After all, at such a long time in his life, the Ancient One never tires of little pleasures like these. It was true with Sherlock back then, and it's still true with Wanda now. Seeing the Ancient One pause from teasing Wanda, Sherlock sighed inwardly, but outwardly, Sherlock maintained his serene demeanor as he continued to address Wanda. Wanda, this is Earth's Sorcerer Supreme, the Ancient One. Arguably one of the most powerful sorcerers on Earth. Master Ancient One, I believe I need no introduction to my apprentice, of course, Wanda Django Maximoff, one of the Maximoff twins. The Ancient One replied immediately after Sherlock finished speaking, nodding to Wanda as a greeting. Wanda, somewhat socially anxious, responded to the Ancient One's greeting, then sat there quietly, waiting for Sherlock's next words like a quail. Sherlock didn't disappoint Wanda and continued to speak to the Ancient One. Master Ancient One, I brought Wanda here not only to fulfill our agreement, but also to address Wanda's own magical power. As you know, her magic is mixed with too much chaos. Sherlock was interrupted by the Ancient One before he could finish his words. He pointed at the world scepter, which Sherlock had been wearing at his waist. I know what you're asking, and I've already given you the answer. The key is in your hands. Sherlock, you must understand that the key you hold is more than just a magical item. Its core is an infinity stone that can warp reality and grant practically any wish. Sherlock was stunned by the Ancient One's words. He removed the world scepter, which had been hanging from his waist, and looked at it from left to right. It's amazing how, enveloped by the scepter, Sherlock sometimes forgot he even had an infinity stone. Furthermore, from what the Ancient One said, it seemed as if the reality stone was the solution to the chaotic magic within Wanda. Sherlock looked at the Ancient One uncertainly, as if hoping for a definitive answer. After all, This mattered to the survival of his magic in the Marvel Universe, and Sherlock couldn't help but be cautious. Seeing Sherlock's eagerness for confirmation, the Ancient One's smile never faded. He calmly picked up the teacup from the coffee table, took a sip, and then continued speaking to Sherlock. "Remember what I told you? Whether it's Wanda the Scarlet Witch or Wanda the Scarlet Witch, it's all your choice. Your choice will lead to countless futures, Sherlock. Just follow your heart." After hearing the Ancient One's words, Sherlock was speechless. Now, Sherlock truly understood why, in his previous life, he'd been bombarded with messages like "Riddler, get off the planet." It was truly excruciating. While he didn't understand the Ancient One's precise meaning, one thing Sherlock understood: his idea wasn't wrong. To solve Wanda's magical problem, he needed the Reality Stone's help. Thinking of this, Sherlock no longer hesitated. A man of action, Sherlock immediately grabbed the World Scepter, embedded with a Reality Stone, from his waist. The moment he grasped the World Scepter, the Reality Stone, as if sensing Sherlock's thoughts, began to emit a soft red glow, quickly enveloping both Sherlock and Wanda. Wanda felt a moment of bewilderment when the red light overwhelmed her. She could sense that this red light was similar to her own power, yet it was a far superior power, capable of completely suppressing her. Just as Wanda was unsure how to react, the Ancient One's voice rang out softly. "Close your eyes, relax your mind, trust your master, trust yourself, and just relax." The Ancient One's words seemed to work a magic. In an instant, Wanda let go of all her complex emotions, feeling a sense of peace and letting go of her inner guard. After all, having been born in Sokovia, a small nation surrounded by war and poverty, and having been involved in Hydra's lab since childhood, Wanda had, unbeknownst to herself, harbored an innate wariness towards everything, even towards her kind master, Sherlock. Miraculously, after the Ancient One's words, Wanda actually let go of that guardedness, becoming completely at peace. Sherlock seemed to be equally impressed. As Wanda lowered her guard, he placed the scepter of the world directly on her forehead. The next second, Sherlock appeared in a pure white world. Apart from Sherlock, there was nothing else in the entire space, not even a shadow. The only thing that existed was a strange-looking tree not far from Sherlock. When Sherlock finally approached the strange-looking tree, he realized it wasn't a tree at all, but a tree-like cage composed of countless silk threads. Countless red threads descended from the sky, intertwining with countless pure white threads rising from the ground. The two constantly intersected and combined, ultimately forming this incredible sight. And within that tree-like cage, composed of countless red and white threads, was a shimmering golden ball of light. Chapter 503 Wanda's Treatment Plan. Taking in the revealing garment before him, Sherlock felt a bit paralyzed. Crucially, Sherlock didn't dare to just jump in and do anything without even a single reference. After all, not even the Ancient One had ever experienced anything like this. Everything was just speculation based on their own knowledge and experience. So, all Sherlock could do now was make bold assumptions and carefully verify them. With this in mind, Sherlock cautiously approached and began to carefully feel this incredibly strange tree. After a while, with a look of confusion on his face, Sherlock gave up the idea of feeling it further, and at the same time, he had a rough idea of what it was. The two threads, red and white, were likely the two types of magic within Wanda's body. The red threads were chaos magic, originating from the sky and representing borrowed magic. The white threads were Wanda's own magic, activated by the Mind Stone. They came from the ground and represented her inherent magic. As for the golden ball of light trapped within the tree body thread cage, it must represent Wanda's spirit, soul, and consciousness, the Trinity. If Sherlock's conjecture is correct, the original form should have been a single red thread forming a tree, representing chaos magic, suspended inverted in the sky. White threads formed a single tree, standing on the ground, while the golden ball of light, representing Wanda, was located between the two trees, representing balance and control. The threads should have connected to the ball of light, not trapped within it as they currently were. Thinking of this, Sherlock couldn't help but curse Hydra internally. After all, those scientific folks didn't need to get involved if they didn't understand. While utilizing the Mind Stone's power successfully allowed Wanda to gain her own magical powers, giving her a starting point unattainable for ordinary people, it also left her with a formidable problem. A child who had once mastered both chaos magic and Sherlock's magic was completely distorted by them. It's no exaggeration to say that without Sherlock, Wanda's future would have been doomed. It's no wonder Wanda's dark turn later in the Marvel films is so intense. After all, if Wanda focused solely on chaos magic, the red threads would grow stronger, eventually devouring the white threads. Add to that the golden orb trapped within, and it's inevitable that it would be affected by chaos magic. Chaos magic itself isn't as easy to deal with as the Trinity of Vishanti, not to mention Wanda's later in-game incorporation of the dark powers of the Darkhold. Of course, despite understanding what these things were, Sherlock didn't immediately begin to manipulate them. Instead, he exited his magical state and began to confer with the Ancient One. Wanda, listening in on the situation, broke into cold sweat. After all, if she hadn't met Sherlock, her future would have been sealed unless she gave up magic. While the Ancient One had never experienced anything like this, his long lifespan had granted him unparalleled experience and knowledge. After Sherlock explained the situation, he almost immediately understood what was happening. After all, magic is a profoundly mysterious thing. What Sherlock saw was merely a manifestation of the reality stone to ensure Sherlock could understand what was before him. Of course, since it could be manifested, it meant Sherlock could tame and manage Wanda's magic. There were two paths open to them. One was to completely abandon chaos magic. As long as Sherlock cut off the red threads emanating from the sky, the remaining problems would be easily resolved. After all, her own magic was easily channeled. After all, it came from within, so it was easy to handle. Even the golden orb could control its own magic. Of course, the side effects were not negligible. After all, without chaos magic, Wanda's most famous magic would be unusable. As Wanda's teacher, Sherlock didn't want to use this method. After all, every teacher in the world wants their students to improve and become as powerful as possible, and Sherlock didn't want to be the one who stifled his apprentice's talent. So, Sherlock went with the second method, gradually untangling the tangled threads, helping Wanda to untangle her magical veins and restore her magic tree to health. Of course, this method was not only time-consuming and laborious, but also, most importantly, it would likely cause Wanda pain, a serious one. After all, the magic was Wanda's, and while it might seem mysterious, it was incredibly sensitive. Sherlock's untangling process was no less painful than directly blasting Wanda's blood vessels and nerves with a cord while she was awake. Of course, despite the pain and effort, the rewards were significant, most importantly, Wanda being able to fully utilize her talents, fully capable of mastering both the powerful chaos magic depicted in the film and Sherlock's magic. As long as Wanda maintains a good balance, it's only a matter of time before her combat power surpasses Sherlock's without the reality stone. However, everything has its downsides. While Wanda gains greater combat power, it also forecloses her from reaching the same level as Sherlock. In other words, with the addition of chaos magic, Wanda's ceiling has been locked. Even if Sherlock were to chop down the chaos magic tree now, Wanda wouldn't be able to follow Sherlock's path. After all, chaos magic is borrowed, and the outcome is predetermined from the outset. The Lord of the Latitudes is no fool to allow his power to create a new Lord of the same ancestry to compete for control of the dimension. Of course, he's deeply concerned about his apprentice, and to spare Wanda some pain, Sherlock politely asks the Ancient One to block her senses every time he combs Wanda's magic. Otherwise, even if Sherlock is careful, a combing session would likely be as agonizing as cruciatus. He couldn't let his apprentice go mad before he could even recover. Ancient One agreed to Sherlock's request without even a second thought. Of course, the price was that Sherlock needed to teach Stephen properly and not cheat. Sherlock naturally wouldn't refuse. As for Wanda, she was both moved and helpless. She was moved by how Sherlock, as her master, truly considered her best interests, even going so far as to use his favors for her future. This alone made Wanda determined that she would never do anything to let Sherlock down. As for the helplessness, well, although she had just said she wouldn't do anything to let Sherlock down, she couldn't resist the change in Sherlock's expression from a humble profiteer to a righteous one after agreeing to proper teaching from Ancient One when he flattered her. It was, well, a bit too embarrassing. Chapter 504 Kamartaj Gadget Sherlock. After deciding on a treatment plan, Sherlock and Ancient One immediately began Wanda's first treatment. The results were impressive. Although the magical threads in Wanda's body were extremely complex, Sherlock, after all, was a rabbit soul in his previous life, and having been trained by those tightly tied bags, he had become incredibly adept at untangling them. After all, Collecting bags was practically ingrained into the DNA of rabbits. Don't ask, the only question is whether you're old enough. You'll awaken when you're old enough. Furthermore, based on the results of the first treatment, it would only take a little over 20 days for Wanda to fully recover to the state Sherlock envisioned. This was a boon for Sherlock. After all, Stephen had a month-long tutorial after joining Camartage, which Sherlock didn't need to attend, so Sherlock could spend that month treating Wanda. The problem was that Wanda's body couldn't handle it. Although the Ancient One had blocked her senses, preventing her from feeling anything, it was still a magical operation. Even if her mind wasn't aware, her body was. The first treatment showed that, despite not suffering any pain, upon regaining consciousness, Wanda felt incredibly sleepy, her clothes soaked with sweat, and she felt like she had just been pulled out of the water. After eating, she slept for most of the day, unable to be awakened. To ensure Wanda's safety, Sherlock and the Ancient One agreed to treat her only in the afternoons. After all, Sherlock feared her body would not be able to handle it all day. This meant that Sherlock could be a slacker in the mornings. As it turned out, Sherlock certainly proved his masculine nature, walking cats and playing with dogs, literally, doing everything in his power. He even transformed into his animagus form and went out to play some minor pranks. As for the prankster, well, our poor comrade Old Wang. It's caused Comrade Wen to get irritated by the sight of birds lately. Honestly, if it weren't for his years of training at Camartage and his respect for the Ancient One's principles of harmony between man and nature, no bird would have been able to escape. After all, anyone who's constantly experiencing bird shit would probably be devastated. Of course, besides teasing Old Wang, Sherlock, in his true form, hasn't been idle either. He often enjoys visiting the library to read, chat with Old Wang, and verbally challenge him. The most infuriating thing is that Old Wang can't track Sherlock. After all, Sherlock's magic isn't any different, but if Sherlock wants to escape, there's really no way he can stop him. What? You're saying that Camartage's magic, like the mirror dimension, can't hold Sherlock? As it turned out, it was impossible to hold him back. After all, Sherlock knew the magic, and with a reality stone in hand, if they really put it to the test, Old Wang couldn't even use the mirror space magic before Sherlock bound him to a chair. And the ropes were made from Old Wang's own clothes. As a result, except for the first few days, Wang practically avoided Sherlock, cursing him inwardly and regretting his decision to provoke that jerk Sherlock. Of course, Sherlock didn't spare any of the other mages besides Old Wang. After all, the last time he came to Camartage, Sherlock had been wearing a vest. This time, without one, Sherlock let loose even more. It's no exaggeration to say that even passing dogs were tempted to chat with Sherlock. Despite Sherlock's extreme social anxiety, he got to know quite a few mages, including Mordo, a mage with whom he hadn't interacted much before. How could Sherlock describe Mordo? He had a strange feeling about him. He didn't give off the same vibe as the king or most of Camartage's mages, but rather the air of a cult priest. And he was, more than anything, the most rigid, ascetic priest. In just a few days, Sherlock had discovered that Mordo seemed to have taken the Ancient One as his own. And most importantly, there were quite a few such people throughout Camartage. Sherlock truly felt the need to discuss this with the Ancient One. After all, being worshipped as a god wasn't a good thing. Unless one couldn't reach the god, in the eyes of these believers, God must be a flawless being. In their eyes, the so-called god was either black or white, with no hint of delicate gray in between. To Sherlock, this was a tremendous shock, especially considering the Ancient One was actually drawing on the power of the dark dimension to maintain his lifespan. Of course, aside from this incident, Sherlock's only real concern during this time was taking over the introductory course for the new mages joining Camartage. It's no wonder Sherlock couldn't stand it, even stepping in to take over. Camartage's introductory course was simply too outrageous. To give a simple example, Camartage's so-called introductory course is like teaching you the 26 English letters on your keyboard, a bunch of symbols, and explaining basics like how to turn your computer on and off. Then, they throw you a directive: come on, use this knowledge to write an intelligent program that's as powerful as Jarvis. How the hell is anyone supposed to write that? Those with more talent would rush to the library to learn some programming language, rather than just trying to figure it out on their own. If they couldn't figure it out, they'd ask a teacher. Those with less talent would simply open their computer's built-in notepad program and start typing away with their meager knowledge of the 26 English letters. If no one had told them that TXT files couldn't be converted into EXE files, they'd probably fill up their computer's memory without even realizing the problem. Fortunately, Sherlock took over this basic education. I can't say much about other things, but when it comes to systematic magic education and summary, HP's magic theory education is truly miles ahead of Kamartaj. After all, looking at the magic books of both sides, it can be seen that, aside from the basic educational courses, Kamartaj only has those advanced magic books that cover only one branch of magic. Meanwhile, the HP magic books Sherlock mastered, in addition to those cutting-edge magic, also includes 7 years of basic education. Chapter 505 Sherlock's Teaching Career, Part 1. Sherlock's life as a slacker in Kamartaj had only lasted a few days when he inexplicably began his teaching career. In the mornings, Sherlock gave beginners tutorials to the group of newly minted magicians, in the afternoons he helped Wanda cultivate her magic, and in the evenings, he prepared lessons. Of course, hard work never fails, especially in a field like magic where real-time feedback is crucial. After a month, Sherlock not only left Kamartaj with a comprehensive and detailed textbook on the fundamentals of magic, but even the graduates under Sherlock's personal guidance achieved significantly higher grades than previous graduates. After all, Sherlock's teaching method meticulously categorized, summarized, and systematically formed every detail. He had copied the process of summarizing magic from the HP world, and it proved that Kamartaj's magic simply couldn't compare to HP's in terms of both its heritage and accessibility. And yet, those newbies under Sherlock's personal guidance, successfully advanced to the rank of magic apprentice, surpassing previous graduates. Stephen, in particular, was a true medical student, capable of memorizing medical textbooks that looked like bricks. Throughout his studies and exams, Stephen's grades were unmatched. Even across Kamartaj, only a handful could surpass Stephen's novice tutorial results, but they were all powerful wizards. Mordo was delighted by this for a long time. On the one hand, he was happy that Kamartaj now had a complete set of novice tutorial materials, and on the other hand, he was happy that Kamartaj was finally producing another powerful wizard. As for Sherlock's apprentice, Wanda, after a month of hard work by Sherlock, Wanda finally performed a correct levitation charm with her wand for the first time in front of Sherlock and the Ancient One. God knows how happy Wanda was to discover that she had mastered Sherlock's technique. Sherlock observed that the little girl's face was as red as a monkey's butt. If Sherlock and the Ancient One hadn't been there, she might have jumped up and down in celebration of finally being able to use magic. Of course, Wanda's happiness didn't last long before Sherlock took her wand and forbidden her from using any magic for 2 full months. Sherlock's reasoning was compelling. After all, Wanda's magic had just been reorganized, and her body needed time to adjust. The reason for not allowing Wanda to use magic was because they feared she wouldn't be able to control both powers, and that frequent use of magic would cause them to merge again. After all, Wanda's current situation perfectly matched the dual cultivation of sex and life described in the comic book Under One Person, which Sherlock had traveled through time before. Sex, in the comics, is explained as magic, and Wanda's previous situation clearly fits the focus on magic, neglecting the cultivation of life. Every time Sherlock thought about this, he couldn't help but curse Hydra, those foolish muggles. After all, his own magic didn't possess the properties of chaos magic. Without magic in a wand, it was difficult for it to manifest any strange properties. Therefore, after Hydra had created Wanda with a Mind Stone, they had forced her to focus on developing chaos magic. This was the primary factor contributing to Wanda's magical imbalance. What Sherlock meant by combining her magic was actually restoring the two powers to their original state, forcibly enhancing Wanda's cultivation of life. Wanda's magical compressing had just been completed, and to use a more Eastern fantasy-like term, her state was unstable, requiring her to strengthen her foundation and cultivate her mind. That was why Sherlock had forbidden her from using magic. Of course, this didn't mean Wanda was idle. Sherlock had tasks for her. Sherlock and the Ancient One requested temporary access to Kamartaj's library. That morning, they had Wanda inside, where she was supposed to learn the theory of chaos magic. They also assigned the librarian, Old Wang, to keep an eye on her, forbidding her from using magic and restricting her to theoretical study. After all, while Sherlock could teach Wanda his own system of magic, he knew nothing about chaos magic. Coincidentally, Kamartaj contained the book on chaos magic, and Sherlock was determined to exploit it. The Ancient One and Wong had no objections to Sherlock's arrangement and agreed to it immediately. Wanda even volunteered to be Wanda's tutor, explaining and demonstrating anything she didn't understand. Sherlock also kept Wanda busy in the afternoon, having her train with the mages of Camartage for physical and combat training. While Sherlock, a turret mage himself, disliked the melee fighting style of Camartage's mages, he had to admit that every Camartage mage possessed formidable physical prowess. This, incidentally, was Wanda's area of weakness. Sherlock felt that Wanda's physical fitness was far too weak and needed to be strengthened. This wasn't Wanda's fault, after all, having been born in the impoverished nation of Sokovia and spent her formative years in Hydra's laboratories, Sherlock could understand her limited physical conditioning. However, since she had become his apprentice, Sherlock couldn't ignore Wanda's weaknesses and insisted on strengthening her training. After all, a strong body would also benefit Wanda's agility in future battles, which would actually increase her evasion rate and survival. More practice would be a good thing. And most importantly, Sherlock had discovered that a strong body made it easier to develop magical power and even more efficient at utilizing it. Either way, it didn't seem like a bad deal. Even taking a step back, a good workout wasn't such a bad thing, was it? After arranging things for Wanda, Sherlock, after less than a week's rest, resumed his regular life in Camartage. Compared to the previous month, Sherlock felt remarkably relaxed. In the mornings, he'd teach the newbies how to use magic. In the afternoons, Sherlock would appear at the training grounds, holding a watermelon, and smilingly watch as the newbies engaged in physical and combat training. Of course, such an arrogant approach would naturally draw some ire, but compared to these young apprentices, Sherlock crushed them in both combat and magic. Would that be a complete waste of 7 years of military training? The only hiccup was Sherlock's refusal to teach Camartage's combat instructor, whose eyes gleamed. After all, Sherlock's combat skills were all learned from his 5 uncles, honed on the battlefield. While lacking in aesthetic appeal, they were guaranteed to deliver a lethal blow. Price, in his own words, declared them too illicit, and Sherlock was forbidden from teaching them on a large scale. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 506 Sherlock's Teaching Career, Part 2. Under Sherlock's guidance, Camartage was thriving, with the exception of Mordo. Mordo couldn't understand why Stephen, who had excelled in the novice tutorial, couldn't even use the simplest and most basic portal during the magic practice. The other apprentices managed to produce a spark with the help of the ring, but Stephen, alone, simply drew circles in the air, producing no sparks at all. Sherlock was equally perplexed. Stephen in the movie could produce a spark, but now, when it came to him, he was just drawing circles in the air? Wasn't that just contempt for him? However, Sherlock, a new teacher, remained patient, repeatedly demonstrating the portal's use and its benefits, determined to ensure that Stephen mastered its use under his guidance. Of course, the result was quite surprising. Sherlock's portal had originally required a snap of the fingers to open, but after repeatedly demonstrating it to Stephen, Sherlock now didn't even need to move, a simple glance could open the portal. The Ancient One, who occasionally passed by, even asked Sherlock several times after witnessing the stunt, if he really didn't want to take over the position of Sorcerer Supreme. This frightened Sherlock. While the Ancient One might not have had any other intentions, Sherlock saw it as nothing more than a pure threat. After a series of painful reflections, Sherlock was ready to fully utilize the sage's strategy of teaching students in accordance with their aptitude. Stephen couldn't produce sparks, right? No problem, let's find a different approach to address Stephen's concerns. So, Sherlock ran to Rabbit and bought over 10 boxes of large fairy wands. He told Stephen to use them to simulate the sparks, repeating to himself in his mind that these were the sparks you would use to open the portal. Sherlock really didn't believe it. How could such a subjective power as magic not work under Stephen's self-hypnosis? Facts proved that it really didn't work. Stephen set off fireworks for more than 3 days, but he didn't learn the extremely basic and simple magic of portal. But it should be said that those apprentices who studied at the same time as Stephen all learned the basic magic of portal under Sherlock's fireworks self-hypnosis therapy. This time, It was not only Sherlock who broke the defense, but even Stephen himself was broken. Stephen was even sure that it was because his hands were crippled that his magic would never succeed. This made Sherlock angry. He almost let Stephen, this fool, experience the joy of heart-wrenching pain. The feeling of powerlessness and blood pressure when teaching Quicksilver appeared in Sherlock's heart again. This time, Sherlock was even more ruthless. He found a mage inside Camartage who had lost both hands and had him demonstrate to Stephen what it meant to not blame Earth's weak gravity for not being able to poop. Stephen himself was dumbfounded as the mage, who didn't even have hands, performed countless spells right before his eyes. Was he truly incapable? Watching Stephen wallow in self-doubt, Sherlock took several deep breaths before barely suppressing his rage. He forced a smile he considered harmonious, walked over to Stephen, and placed a potion in his hand. This is the thing that will heal your hands. There will be strange side effects for 24 hours, but don't worry, the side effects won't affect the healing effect. If you truly believe your hands are hindering your magic, you can use the potion I gave you to heal them and try again. With that, Sherlock turned and left. What? Aren't you afraid that Stephen will simply quit after healing his hands? No kidding. When presented with the opportunity to gain supernatural powers, how many people would willingly give up such a chance and return to their ordinary lives? Moreover, after being tempered by the Ancient One, Stephen had already given up his previous pursuit of wealth and fame. Despite this, Stephen still drank Sherlock's potion at night. After all, his hands were a source of worry for Stephen, and a successful cure would be best, even if it wasn't. However, Stephen immediately regretted the decision after drinking it. He had considered countless ways to mitigate the side effects, but as a doctor, Sherlock's potion side effects were a bit beyond Stephen's understanding. The side effect of the potion was simple: any clothing Stephen wore would become transparent. Simply put, it was the Emperor's new clothes, a manifestation of reverse invisibility. Stephen now faced only two options: either run naked through Camartage tomorrow or hide in his room. However, with his hands now healed, Stephen had no intention of missing Sherlock's magic class. After pondering for half the night, he made a bold decision. So, the next morning, Dr. Strange Stephen, wearing a barrel, appeared on the training grounds, drawing everyone's attention. Despite Stephen's repeated attempts to explain his clothing, the looks he received were clear disbelief. Even Sherlock looked at Stephen with a strange expression. If it weren't for the entry above Stephen's head, Sherlock would have suspected he'd awakened some unsavory hobby. It was quite remarkable, though, that the barrel wasn't even considered clothing by the entry, perhaps because it didn't come into significant contact with Stephen's body. Of course, aside from this minor incident, Stephen, having healed his hands, had made some progress, but only a little. Yes, Stephen could already draw sparks. But it was clear that Sherlock no longer had the patience to wait for Stephen to undergo another round of self-hypnosis for the fireworks portal. So, Sherlock decided to use the movie method to help Stephen quickly master the basics of portal magic. And surprisingly, on the summit of Mount Everest, Stephen had successfully mastered the portal and escaped in less than 5 minutes. Sherlock saw through this guy's true colors. Goodness me, this guy is a piece of shit. If you don't use some ruthless tactics, you really can't make him improve. Just like those elementary school kids who just started school before the time travel, expecting these naughty kids to learn on their own initiative without using strategic weapons like shoehorns, feather dusters, slipper soles, and broomsticks is pure nonsense. Having found the trick, Sherlock became more and more adept at teaching. However, for some reason, the students taught by Sherlock would occasionally stare at Steve standing in the group with resentful eyes when Sherlock took out a pink pineapple machine gun. Chapter 507 Sherlock's Teaching Career, Part 2. After unlocking his hardcore teaching methods with Stephen, Sherlock decisively abandoned the sage's advice to teach students in accordance with their aptitude. Facts proved that nothing was impossible to learn, only intimidation was insufficient. Because everyone was a former muggle-turned-magician, they instinctively feared the black muzzle of Sherlock's weapon, and thus, Sherlock's teaching journey was surprisingly smooth. Every morning, Sherlock would sit on a platform he had created through transfiguration, the black muzzle of his giant pink pineapple pointed directly at the students practicing magic below. If Sherlock caught anyone slacking off, he would unleash a barrage of bullets at their feet, showing no mercy. Even if they accidentally injured someone, Sherlock would heal them instantly. Among these students, Sherlock quickly transformed from a kinda knowledgeable teacher to a demon teacher from hell. Even the entire Camartage had become accustomed to the sound of gunfire every morning, like New Year's firecrackers. Of course, the students didn't resist. Under Sherlock's pressure, many went to Mordo to complain. Of course, the rigid Mordo, true to his word, also watched Sherlock's teaching for 2 days. Even with Mordo watching, Sherlock didn't care, letting things slide. He first used his magic to demonstrate Camartage's signature buckler technique, then explained the necessary precautions. Then, Sherlock went off to the platform to set up his gun. While Mordo found Sherlock's teaching style a bit stiff, seeing the students practicing with such dedication, he opened his mouth but couldn't say anything. After a morning of practice, Sherlock even brought back his old school routine, telling the students to write an A4-sized paper on the subject of shield magic and hand it in to him the next morning. There would also be a quiz the following morning. After hearing Sherlock's words, the students were stunned, their faces as black as if their mother had died. However, under the threat of Sherlock's gun, they remained silent, turning silently to the cafeteria. Mordo also became interested in Sherlock's so-called pop quiz and showed up at the training ground early the next morning to see how Sherlock conducted it. It turned out that Sherlock's hardcore teaching methods were even harder. Sherlock simply took out an Asimov-patterned AK-47 and placed it on a table he had conjured up on the training ground. The test was simple: students cast a magic shield, and if they could withstand a full-power 7.62mm armor-piercing round from his AK, they would pass. Of course, if they couldn't withstand it, it didn't matter. At most, they would be hit by one bullet. But don't worry, Sherlock wasn't some devil, and he certainly wouldn't let the students get shot in Camartage, right? If you can't handle it and get hit by a bullet, Sherlock will give you first aid on the spot. Don't underestimate Sherlock's potions, they guarantee you won't leave a single scar. However, your grades won't be as good, and you'll need to practice more. When you can handle it, you can continue studying. Of course, as for the potentially fatal side effects, you'll have to deal with them on your own. And I wonder if that idiot who's been arranging the side effects entries lately has taken a liking to anatomy, as many entries are related to it. In just one morning, the training grounds were filled with skeletons with internal organs. Humanoid figures composed solely of blood vessels, humanoid figures composed solely of nerves, things that would delight medical students. Of course, in a situation like this, there must be some stuntmen. This time, the stuntmen were 2 girls. One girl had Western-looking features, but the effect was that only her skin remained, leaving everything else invisible. She looked like a humanoid puppet dressed in clothes, a true Chinese horror. The other was a typical Oriental woman. This unfortunate individual's effect was that the external obstruction of her skin memory disappeared, leaving her looking like a living, flayed person, a pure Western horror. The 2 girls took the exam one after the other, and then experienced this strange side effect. Then, in perfect unison, they both pulled out mirrors to check their appearance and let out a piercing scream. Attracted by each other's screams, they locked eyes, then let out even more agonizing screams, their eyes rolling back as they passed out. Such situations had become a common occurrence in Sherlock's teachings. The apprentices handled them expertly, first isolating the 2, then pinching their philtrum to bring them back to consciousness. What? Take them away to rest? Are you kidding? They failed the exam, and you're still resting? Only idiots who can't learn magic would rest. People like them, with bright futures, need constant practice. These were Sherlock's exact words. Of course, where there's joy, there's joy. Those who failed the exam were especially popular with the instructors in the afternoon combat class. After all, previously, teaching how hitting a specific area would cause the enemy to vomit or faint could only be done verbally. Now, with a living teaching aid right before their eyes, not utilizing it would be a complete waste. Consequently, those students who failed the Sherlock exam in the morning often had to endure a subsequent whipping by the combat instructor in the afternoon, a truly tragic experience. Mage Mordo, observing the entire process, simply frowned. After some thought, he decided to report this to the Ancient One, as he wasn't sure whether this teaching method was a good or bad one. However, when Mordo arrived at the Ancient One's room to report the incident, the Ancient One said nothing but handed Mordo a dozen of the daily Sherlock reports. Mordo's eyes nearly popped out of his head as he read the reports. In just under a month, These novice apprentices had already mastered a quantity and quality of magic that rivaled those of mages who had been at Kamartaj for over 6 months. With the data starkly before him, Mordo couldn't help but believe it. He even began to question whether Kamartaj was too lax and whether he should adopt Sherlock's teaching methods when purchasing a new batch of guns. Of course, with the data starkly before him, Mordo had no problem with Sherlock's teaching methods and even secretly circulated the data. Upon hearing Sherlock's teaching results, the mages who had already undergone the training and were pursuing their own studies were all in disbelief. Those who had been somewhat slacking off immediately perked up and began to study diligently. After all, they were considered seniors after all. If they were truly surpassed by those apprentices, they would be utterly humiliated in Kamartaj for the rest of their lives. Don't think that Kamartaj is free of the underworld. In a place like this, the underworld atmosphere is actually even more prevalent. Even Sherlock himself didn't know that due to his unintentional operation, a trend called involution had quietly spread to every corner of Kamartaj. Chapter 508, Kamartaj's style is a bit off. Sherlock certainly wouldn't dare to say anything else, but when it comes to Stephen's education, since it's already been mentioned by the Ancient One, Sherlock is definitely going to pay attention. However, judging by the current situation, it seems that Stephen no longer needs Sherlock's attention. After all, Stephen is more competitive than anyone else. Of course, Sherlock understands. After all, at this point, if Stephen appears in public, he will receive a lot of resentful looks. Not to mention Stephen, even if you're Steve, you will have to be crazy competitive. After all, if you don't become a true competitive king, Stephen is really afraid of being caught by someone if you're not careful. This is why the dormitories in Kamartaj are single rooms. If 2 or more people live in the same room, Stephen may have to take turns keeping watch at night. Especially after the wave of involution spread throughout Kamartaj, Stephen's involution became even more intense. After all, it was only his peers who initially looked at him with resentment, but now even the mages who had been at Kamartaj for a long time began to look at him the same way. Stephen was truly terrified. After all, his peers only needed to outdo them. Who knew the extent of the mages who had already entered Kamartaj? So, for the sake of his life and reputation, Stephen, with the attitude of studying until he died, began to involution frantically. Even after mastering the magic of astral projection, he continued studying at night while his body slept. Driven by Stephen's influence, the involution of Kamartaj intensified. One side worked hard to find a way to trap him, while the other side worked hard to learn and strengthen themselves, just to avoid being trapped. It was a positive cycle. Amidst the internal conflict sweeping across Kamartaj, aside from the Ancient One and Sherlock, the only one who could remain unscathed was probably Wanda. Even if Wanda hadn't been swept up in this internal conflict, she still felt terrified, even trembling at the thought of her future. After all, after witnessing Sherlock's teaching methods, Wanda began to worry whether her future would be the same as those of the students at Kamartaj. Furthermore, Wanda suspected that if the time came, her only choice would likely be the color of the gun Sherlock was holding. At most, since they were his disciples, she could choose any bullet color. Of course, Sherlock didn't know about Wanda's thoughts, but even if he did, he would only pat Wanda on the head and console her with a reassuring remark, "You're overthinking it. We have a formal and legal teaching process and materials." Well, after all, since they were his own disciples, Sherlock certainly wouldn't be as brutal as he is now. Kamartaj had its own rules, and Sherlock had to apply them to some degree. That's right, Kamartaj had its own rules. Besides the regular combat training every afternoon, the training for these new students was actually only 2 months. In those 2 months, as long as these new students had mastered the basics of Kamartaj's magic, they would graduate. The rest depended entirely on their luck and hard work. Of course, under Sherlock's devilish teaching methods, these students had learned far more than just those basic spells in those 2 months. Since they had nothing to do anyway, Sherlock naturally had to teach them more. After all, watching these students fight each other, even looking at him with eyes filled with helpless anger, Sherlock found it very interesting. Don't ask, the answer is that you just like the feeling of disliking me, but being unable to do anything about it. Of course, one thing must be acknowledged, Sherlock's arduous teaching had a profound impact on Kamartaj. While I wouldn't dare mention anything else, the habits these students developed after graduating 2 months later alone were enough to elevate the mages of Kamartaj to a new level. Don't underestimate the power of habit. Just like veterans who've just left the army, if you don't practice, you always feel like something's missing. Some veterans have even developed muscle memory, and even after decades of service, they still leap to their feet at the sound of the reveille. Of course, while his teaching duties were over, that didn't mean Sherlock could leave Camartage. After all, his apprentice still had a talent for chaos magic. After completing his 2-month temporary teaching stint at Camartage, Sherlock asked the Ancient One to teach Wanda chaos magic, and the Ancient One had no objection. It was partly because the Ancient One wanted to strengthen Sherlock's connection with Camartage, and partly because of Wanda. It's undeniable that Wanda is a true magical genius. Had Hydra's muggles not already determined her path forward, without any understanding of magic, the Ancient One might even have considered tricking her into inheriting his position as Sorcerer Supreme. According to their agreement, Sherlock would teach Wanda HP magic in the morning, and in the afternoon, the Ancient One would teach her the applications of chaos magic and practice it. Originally, these matters had nothing to do with the mages of Camartage, but after witnessing Sherlock teaching Wanda magic on the training grounds, the resentment in the eyes of these mages, especially those who graduated from Sherlock's school, intensified. The reason for this deep resentment among these graduates was Sherlock's teaching methods. My goodness, when teaching them, there were all these guns and cannons, and Sherlock even had them practice with him holding the muzzle of a gun against their heads. He even had to feel the sensation of a bullet fired from modern technology hitting them. But why do you idiot, speak so softly when teaching your own apprentice? It's almost like your voice is so soft and muffled. Where are all those guns and cannons? Where's that sweet, honeyed little mouth of yours? Are you really so impudent just because we're not your apprentices? Stephen, in particular, gave Sherlock the most complicated look of the entire group. After all, compared to these other students, he used to worry about getting sacked. But despite his resentment, he had to admit that the magic Sherlock taught Wanda seemed to be more in line with the world's definition of magic than the magic of Camartage. I can't say anything else, but at least it was really convenient. Of course, Sherlock's teachings were not hidden from these Camartage mages, and these unaware Camartage mages initially wanted to steal a few tricks. But soon these people found that they could not learn Sherlock's magic at all. Even if they understood what Sherlock said, they could not use Sherlock's magic. Gradually, everyone gave up the idea of stealing. Of course, there were still some onlookers. After all, when Sherlock occasionally practiced with Wanda, the effect and power were really beautiful. Chapter 509, Conflicted Stephen. With Sherlock and the Ancient One's generous guidance, Sherlock even dared to guarantee that his apprentice, Wanda, would be the most improved magic apprentice in all of Camartage. Of course, Wanda wasn't yet suited to Sherlock's powerful dark arts. After all, Wanda wasn't Sherlock, and Sherlock still needed to consider the potential impact of those dark arts on her. Everything seemed to be moving in a positive direction, but for some reason, Sherlock had recently felt that the Ancient One's gaze was filled with strange depths. Of course, if Sherlock and the Ancient One's teachings to Wanda had no effect, then our unfortunate Stephen would be furious. Having just recovered from the sack crisis, he erupted again when everyone saw Sherlock so tenderly teaching his apprentice. Stephen once again recalled the fear of being dominated by the sack. The tide of involution has once again swept across Camartage. The old wizard, reluctant to intervene, frantically mentored Stephen's contemporaries. Stephen, in turn, was unfazed, constantly navigating a problem he couldn't solve, often harassing Sherlock, Mordo, or the Ancient One. After Stephen's persistent harassment, Sherlock discovered his secret. It's safe to say he's become renowned among doctors for only performing difficult surgeries and earning a fortune. Unlike the others, who were blindly and involuntarily, Stephen's involution was also intense, but his was a highly planned and structured one, a true testament to the concept of involution. Just look at Stephen's journey to involution. After discovering a trick to allow his body to sleep at night and his spirit to study magic outside of his body, Stephen discovered another powerful tool in the library. Yes, it's the same magic used in the film during the final battle with Thanos. Stephen, who is well versed in the art of involution, immediately after discovering the magic of clone, he frantically pestered Wang, Mordo, and Sherlock to teach him his magic. Then, in the middle of the night, he would use the two magics of clone and soul out to secretly involution, acting like a complete school whore. Even the portal was used by Stephen very skillfully, and he would always open a small door in the middle of the night to get books from the library. As for the consequence of this, Wang has recently been questioning his life to Sherlock, saying that he is getting old, and sometimes he can't even find the book he wants to read, but after a period of time, he can find the book again. Sherlock smiled and said nothing, and vowed that there was something wrong with Wang, and that he would get Wang some healing potion to drink, which should be able to relieve the problem. Wang thanked Sherlock profusely for this. As for the potion, it was pure nonsense. After all, the culprit was Stephen, the Wang's close protégé, and he had absolutely no connection to the Wang. Sherlock supposed the potion was just some strong liquor with the alcohol flavor removed and some added ingredients. And you know what? After drinking it, Wang praised it as truly delicious, though he felt a burning sensation and itching all over his body for some reason. Sherlock simply smiled, keeping his fame to himself. But one thing Sherlock knew, any plane that dared to fly over Kamartaj tonight would likely be destroyed. Everything seemed so beautiful, it almost felt like normal life at Kamartaj. No one noticed that the Ancient One, who usually carried the Eye of Agamotto, had ceased to carry the treasure of Kamartaj. However, everyone soon learned of this when, one afternoon, a violent space-time disturbance spread almost instantly across Kamartaj. Sherlock, Wang, and Mordo rushed at breakneck speed towards the eruption of the force of time and space. After all, if this thing wasn't properly handled, the entire planet could be in tatters. Fortunately, this incident didn't cause any significant damage. By the time Sherlock arrived, Mordo and Wang had already dealt with the situation. Meanwhile, the two, sweating profusely, were lecturing Stephen on the dangers of time magic. What? Why don't you use a portal or applet to find Stephen, the one who caused the time-space fluctuations? No kidding. That's the force of time and space. It's a deadly thing, and who dare to risk their lives? With luck, you might even survive, but with bad luck, you're doomed. Through their explanation, Stephen seemed to realize how close he'd gotten to disaster, and he explained the reason with some hesitation, which caught Mordo's attention. Mordo was furious that Stephen had secretly read the magic book. After all, the last person to do so was Caecilius, now a follower of the dimensional pervert Dormammu. Stephen was completely stunned when he heard words like Dormammu and fallen into darkness. He had never imagined that a mage could have such a powerful enemy. If Mordo hadn't explained this to Stephen tonight, he would have always believed that the mages of Kamartaj were just secluded individuals, absorbed in their magical pursuits. He, Stephen, had come to heal his hands, not to engage in some goddamn magical war. Even though his hands had healed, Stephen still had no desire to engage in a magical war, yet he couldn't let go of the magnificent magic of Kamartaj. He awkwardly declared that he needed to rest and think about his next move. Neither Mordo nor Old Wen commented on this. After all, throughout Kamartaj, as long as one didn't ally with Dormammu, the mages there adhered to the principle of fully respecting the wishes of others. The internal conflict Sherlock had stirred up was, in their eyes, a miracle of Kamartaj. Sherlock, however, understood Stephen's hesitation. Although he had originally intended to heal his hands, after they were healed, Stephen never again mentioned returning to medicine. After all, no one could resist the allure of magic. Sherlock believed that magic held an innate appeal to humans, like laundry detergent. Learning itself was a process of slow reward, and precisely because of this, learning was considered unnatural. Magic, however, was different. The reward for achievement was immediate. Once you learned a spell, you knew it, and you could use it immediately. No one would resist such rapid, immediate reward for achievement. No one. Chapter 510 It's You, Uncle Ba. It was already noon the next day when Sherlock saw Stephen. Sherlock had planned to use the portal in Kamartaj to head to Hong Kong to pick up some goodies for himself and his beloved apprentice, but instead he saw Stephen standing in front of the portal, a bewildered look on his face. Stephen glanced at Sherlock and greeted him. It was clear from the look on Stephen's face that he still hadn't decided whether to return to being a doctor or join the magical war to protect the world. Just as Sherlock was about to say something to Stephen, the portal began to vibrate violently, and a panicked mage emerged from the portal leading to the London Temple in England. Before the mage could say anything, a transparent weapon, seemingly formed from folded space, flew out of the portal and pierced the poor mage. Unlike Sherlock, Stephen, witnessing someone being killed right in front of him for the first time, was instantly terrified. Driven by a survival instinct, Stephen almost instinctively grabbed Sherlock's arm and ran towards the portal to the New York Temple. Sherlock didn't even have time to refuse before Stephen dragged him to the New York Temple. The mages in the New York Temple, upon seeing Stephen's panic, looked at him and Sherlock with questioning expressions. Seeing the other mages, Stephen seemed to find his composure and shouted, "An attack is coming." As Stephen finished speaking, Caecilius, the man Mordo had described as having fallen into darkness, entered through the portal. Caecilius was no fool. As the main base, Caecilius wasn't sure he could take down Camartage in one fell swoop, but having already taken down the London Temple, he figured Feng Zhang had been spotted, and that taking down another temple wouldn't be a problem. So, he led his men and followed the two men directly into the New York Temple. Honestly, Sherlock didn't really care about Caecilius. After all, to Sherlock, it was nothing more than a matter of fire. Even if Caecilius gained greater power from Dormammu, as long as he was still essentially mortal, Sherlock could kill him. At the very least, it would be a desperate attempt to get the upper hand. So, Sherlock was still very curious about Caecilius. The moment he saw Caecilius and his men emerge from the portal, Sherlock was stunned. "It's you. That good-mannered Uncle Ba." A question mark slowly formed in the head of the pig-tailed Caecilius after hearing Sherlock's call, as if wondering if Sherlock's words had some hidden meaning. But Caecilius quickly gave up the thought. After all, to him, everyone present was his target, including the casually dressed newcomer who looked like he had just joined Camartage. Sherlock, for his part, felt a bit embarrassed after unleashing his innermost thoughts. Well, before crossing over, Sherlock was indeed a fan of pullback. Who couldn't love the timeless elegance of pullback? But now, after seeing Caecilius, Sherlock's urge to criticize him was overwhelmed. While Caecilius certainly bore pullback's cool and austere features, the heavy eyeshadow, like dark circles under his eyes, really detracted from pullback's appearance. Sherlock mentally despised the aesthetics of the Marvel makeup artists who worked on the film before crossing over. Pullback was such a good guy, if he'd improved his looks, he could have attracted a ton of fans. But look at this look, created by some unknown stylist. With a pigtail, dark circles under his eyes, and a slightly peeling appearance, he looked more like a heavy metal musician in heavy makeup than a mage who had defected to Dormammu. Sherlock's rage grew with each thought. Unable to contain himself, he secretly pulled out the wizard's wand and launched a surprise attack on Caecilius, even as Stephen stared in shock. Caecilius, in turn, was stunned by the sight of Sherlock's wand. When Sherlock's spell struck him, he felt as if he'd died before his very last attempt. But soon, Caecilius realized something was amiss. He didn't seem to feel any pain. Slowly opening his eyes, Caecilius noticed everyone's gazes darting between him and Sherlock, looking at him with a strange quirk. Everyone's face was filled with a look of shock, even the men behind him. Confused, Caecilius turned his head slightly to peer through the nearby glass. Finally, he understood why everyone was looking at him that way. That's right. Sherlock, fed up with Marvel stylists' wasted effort, had just surprised Caecilius, forcibly transfiguring him with a new look. Yes, the look from Hannibal. While the slashing eyeshadow remained, it at least looked much more harmonious, even giving Caecilius, who played Hannibal, a fierce aura that Hannibal lacked. Nice aesthetic, even Caecilius couldn't help but exclaim in praise after catching sight of his new look in the reflection of the glass. Of course, look at who I am. After hearing Hannibal's praise, Sherlock gloated to Caecilius, as if he had accomplished something truly remarkable. This left the New York Temple's mages, Caecilius's minions, speechless, and even Caecilius himself speechless. Goodness me, there's definitely something wrong with this guy's brain. Not only did you not use some powerful magic to launch a surprise attack, but you actually gave the enemy leader a stylish look? And you're not even ashamed of it, you're proud of it? Everyone looked at Sherlock, gloating, with expressions of "I don't understand, I'm shocked." It was clear that almost everyone present was cursing profanely. Even Caecilius was stunned for a moment before shaking his head with a very Uncle Boss smile and continuing. "Although your aesthetics are quite good, it still doesn't change the fact that you will die here today." As the words fell, the entire New York Temple began to distort. That's right, Caecilius had directly covered the entire New York Temple with a mirror space. Chapter 511 Strange Strangeness. The moment Caecilius's mirror image enveloped the entire New York Temple, Stephen sensed a sense of foreboding and turned to flee. This time, however, Stephen didn't intend to drag Sherlock along, he simply turned and fled, while the remaining mages stationed at the New York Temple drew their weapons and prepared to fight. As for Sherlock, You might not believe it, but he remained calm and composed, seemingly with no intention of intervening. After all, to Sherlock, whether it was Caecilius or the minions behind him, they were nothing more than a single fire spell. At worst, he could use the vast amount of dark magic in his HP to deal with these minor figures, who posed no threat to Sherlock. And Caecilius was no fool. As the former senior brother of Camartage, he naturally understood the significance of the wand in Sherlock's hand. Seeing Sherlock merely folding his arms and watching the show, showing no intention of intervening, Caecilius gave Sherlock a graceful, slight bow and, without hesitation, turned to chase the fleeing Stephen. Sherlock, though surprised that Caecilius had begun to align himself with the Ancient One after he had given him a new skin, remained silent. After all, in Sherlock's view, this was Stephen's trial, and it was inappropriate for an outsider like him to interfere with the Ancient One's plans. Meanwhile, Caecilius's minions began to clash with the mages of the New York Temple, while Sherlock began to observe the distorted mirror dimension. For some reason, Sherlock felt a sense of familiarity as he observed the distorted, almost blurry, mirror dimension. After pondering for a while, Sherlock finally understood why he felt so familiar with this so-called mirror dimension. He had felt a sense of déjà vu the first time he encountered it. Wasn't this the Limbo from DMC, Devil May Cry? That's right. The more Sherlock looked, the more resemblance he felt. Turning to look at the New York Temple mages battling Caecilius's minions, the smell was even stronger. It was no wonder Sherlock was imagining things this way. The twisting and distorting of the building's interior, even the splinters and cracks appearing out of thin air, wasn't that exactly like Limbo in the game? Add to that the 5 familiar moves of the melee mages, and if you add a white-haired Dante or something, wouldn't this be a straight-up game trailer? The resemblance grew stronger and stronger, and Sherlock could hardly contain his wicked amusement. He simply couldn't find a reason to attack. But Sherlock soon found one, because he noticed that the New York Temple mages seemed a bit overwhelmed against Caecilius's minions. But on second thought, it made sense. After all, Caecilius' minions were once mages of Camartage, and now, with Dormammu's dark power, they had gained a lot of power. While their appearance had become more shabby, their strength had clearly increased. In a situation where two sides are on the same side, it's understandable that these pure Camartage mages are no match for these mages who have fallen to darkness. Of course, given his close relationship with the Ancient One, Sherlock couldn't just stand by and watch these mages fall. After some thought, Sherlock finally sighed in resignation and prepared to personally deal with these unfortunate creatures. Sherlock's plan was simple. First, he would use his magical senses to detect the Camartage mages, then use a summoning charm to summon them to a small box he had prepared, similar to Newt's. Then, he could immerse himself in Dante cosplay. Sherlock's plan was a beautiful one, but when he actually put it into action, it went awry. The moment Sherlock's senses were released, upon contact with the mages fallen to darkness, an indescribable feeling nearly overwhelmed him. That's right, a complete overwhelm, both physically and mentally. But Sherlock couldn't be blamed. After all, in Sherlock's perception, the smell, the appearance, and even the very life of these fallen mages was enough to disgust him. Speaking of the smell, it was like the world's foulest substance mixed with rotting seafood stirred into a never-cleaned public toilet in the middle of summer. The mere sensation was enough to make Sherlock sick to his stomach. Putting aside the smell, in Sherlock's magical perception, the life forms and even the physical forms of these mages who had fallen into darkness could no longer be called human. If Sherlock had to find a way to describe it, it would be like seeing a monster covered in eyes, with limbs and torso in utter disproportion. The smell, the appearance, and even the life were enough to make Sherlock, a dimensional master born on Earth, feel a physical revulsion. But that wasn't the most extreme. The most extreme was the psychological revulsion. It was a strange feeling, and Sherlock found it difficult to describe. After all, in his entire 2 lifetimes, Sherlock had never experienced such a disgusting feeling. It was like a naughty kid from an unknown relative's house walking into your room during Chinese New Year, regardless of whether you were asleep or not, destroying your models, changing your game saves, and even using your hard-earned diamond account to show off his elementary school skills in a ranked match. A feeling of having his territory invaded instantly spread through Sherlock's heart the moment he sensed those corrupted and dark mages. A strong desire to kill these corrupted and dark mages took root in Sherlock's mind like a seed the moment his magical senses passed over them. It was like discovering a giant spider in your bed just before you turn in for bed, only to have it vanish in the blink of an eye, forcing you to fight the damn thing to the death, even at the cost of your sleep. This strange feeling instantly alerted Sherlock. After all, this was a matter of Camartage and or Mamu. Sherlock shouldn't have been so disgusted with these corrupted mages. And after experiencing that emotional outburst, Sherlock began to become extremely sensitive to changes in his emotions. After all, Sherlock didn't want to experience what happened last time again. Chapter 512 Immersive Experience Devil May Cry Game. Fighting back the nausea, Sherlock repeatedly felt his own emotional shifts. Soon, he realized something: his revulsion didn't seem to affect him too much. His urge to eliminate these mages who had fallen into darkness immediately eased after a mage defeated one of Caecilius's minions. It seemed as if he could eliminate these dark mages, the urge wouldn't affect him. Although Sherlock knew there was something fishy about this feeling, after repeated attempts to understand it, he couldn't find the cause. Temporarily suppressing his curiosity, he focused on the matter at hand. Forcing himself to suppress his discomfort, Sherlock used his vast magical senses to directly mark all the mages in the New York Temple before any of the Camartage mages died. The next moment, the mages, still locked in combat with Caecilius's minions, felt as if they were suddenly possessed by an inexplicable force. Their feet suddenly left the ground uncontrollably, and they flew in one direction. No matter how hard they tried, they couldn't stop their flying bodies. But soon, the tension on the mages' faces eased as they realized they were flying not in any other direction, but in the direction of the young man holding the wizard's staff. But soon, the relief on the faces of the mages flying towards Sherlock turned to horror as they watched eagerly as a small briefcase suddenly appeared in Sherlock's hands. The one closest to Sherlock dove directly into the briefcase, followed by the second, and the third. Like a bottomless pit, the small briefcase continuously devoured the mages of the New York Temple. The Western mages were relatively calm, merely worried about whether the suitcase could really hold so many people present, and some worried that it would be too crowded. However, the Eastern mages paled with fear. The reason was simple: Sherlock's object was too much like something that existed only in myth and imagination. At that moment, the minds of these Eastern wizards were filled with thoughts of things like purple gold gourds, and they were also confused. They hadn't even heard anyone call their names, so how could they have been taken away for no apparent reason? Sherlock had no idea of the wizards' subtle plans. After successfully stuffing all the wizards into the box, Sherlock locked it shut, gathered up his wands, and instead picked up the world scepter, which had been hanging from his waist. Caecilius's minions were still puzzled. Why did the guy who had previously been holding back now take action? And even seemed to be siding with them, taking down all the wizards of Camartage? Could it be that he was bewitched by the imposing image of his boss, Caecilius? Well, while they didn't understand, if that was the case, they would have supported him. But they soon realized they were wrong, and wrong in a big way. As Sherlock grasped the world scepter, it shone with a dazzling red light. When the blinding glow faded, Caecilius's followers were astonished to discover that the young man had transformed. He now wore a striking trench coat, a tight white vest underneath, and his pants, though otherwise ordinary, had a certain embellishment that gave him a rock and roll vibe. Furthermore, even Sherlock's hair had transformed into true, pure white, a source of ecstasy for those who favored white hair. However, this wasn't the most shocking moment. The most striking was the transformation of the world scepter in Sherlock's hand. It had now transformed into a massive, full-height sword. Just the sight of that pitch-black sword was enough to chill one's heart. Caecilius's followers were certain, regardless of its sharpness, that it would result in death or crippling damage if struck. What the group of players didn't know was that any Devil May Cry player present could instantly identify Sherlock's current appearance and the name of the great sword he held. Indeed, to satisfy his own wicked desires, Sherlock had used the world scepter to twist himself into the form of Dante, even recreating the sort of rebellion. While the group of players were still perplexed, Sherlock made his move. With seemingly magical speed, he swooped down on a dazed player and struck him with his sword. Watching the gleaming cold light of the sword's blade as it slashed down at him, the player barely reacted, their mind racing to the thought, "This is my life." However, the player soon realized something was amiss. While the sword had sent him flying backwards, the damage didn't seem serious. A careful inspection revealed that the seemingly sharp sword had inflicted about the same damage as a wallpaper knife. Perhaps even less. This effect might seem strange to others, but anyone who's played Devil May Cry will exclaim, right. Right, after all, while Dante's rebellion sword might seem impressive, it's never a one-hit kill against mobs. Which mob doesn't require a series of combos before they can safely be defeated? To perfectly cosplay Dante, Sherlock even copied the in-game damage. The Reality Stone was quite the surprise. Having served countless masters, this was the first time anyone had asked it to contort into a hard-to-kill greatsword. However, Sherlock's actions proved that he wasn't just an ally, as Cassilis's minions had assumed, but a legitimate enemy. Coupled with the impressive damage of the Mercy greatsword, the minions were no longer afraid of Sherlock, and they all rushed towards him, howling. But they soon realized they were wrong, utterly wrong. Sherlock's weapons were indeed difficult to kill, but that didn't mean he couldn't kill them. In a short while, 9 of the 10 minions Cassilis had brought with him had experienced brutality. After all, anyone would be resentful if they were subjected to a multitude of attacks, nunchakus, modern firearms, massive scythes, broadswords, fists, in a short period of time, only to be slain by a continuous accumulation of minor wounds. What? Wasn't there one left? Well, that one had luckily avoided Sherlock's presence and instead ran to Cassilis' aid. Sherlock wasn't in a hurry at all. After dispatching the small fry, he shouldered his greatsword and slowly made his way towards the minions and Cassilis. Sherlock was truly intoxicated by the immersive cosplay experience. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 513 The Debate Between Immortality and Death. After Sherlock meticulously adorned himself with Dante's costume, a complete gemstone twist, and ascended to the second floor with Dante's swagger, he spotted Cassilis, restrained by a strange device and kneeling on the ground. You can't help but wonder, after Sherlock changed into David's skin, and with that strange restraint device, Cassilis now looked incredibly sexually charged. If you could overlook the dark, gothic, and shattered makeup on Cassilis' face, he would look like a perfectly abstinent, down-on-his-luck hero. Cassilis himself was stunned for a moment when he saw Sherlock approaching with a greatsword, but then his David's smile returned. A wizard? I never thought that the legendary, most powerful and mysterious Avenger would have such a young face beneath the guise of the Avenger. Sherlock, who had originally wanted to tease Cassilis about not having to pay him such a high tribute, was stunned when he heard Cassilis' words. He casually stuck his sword into the ground and then strolled towards Cassilis. Wow, I didn't expect that you, a group of fallen and dark wizards, would also pay attention to the Avengers? This is really unexpected. Hearing Sherlock's words, Cassilis frowned slightly, but soon relaxed and refuted Sherlock's words calmly. I saw you firsthand, wizard, the first time you visited Camartage. Of course I'd take notice of you, a wizard so completely different from the one who lived there. As for your talk of corruption, I'm sorry, but I beg to differ. I simply wish to lead humanity to evolution and immortality. I want everyone to enjoy the rights secretly hidden by the Ancient One. To accomplish this, Lord Dormammu must descend upon Earth. In my opinion, this isn't corruption, it's more appropriate to call us pioneers. We are merely pioneers who want the human species to evolve towards immortality. Cassilius's face was filled with sincerity, as if there was nothing wrong with what he said. He truly was a great pioneer, and he looked proudly at Sherlock, who stood across from him. Sherlock was almost laughing at Cassilius's words, his expression instantly turning to a thick layer of mockery. Harbinger? Immortality? Cassilius, don't tell me that's how Dormammu brainwashed you. I believe that Dormammu's dark magic can prolong life, but immortality? Don't be ridiculous. Nothing can be immortal, not even the universe. What's more, for life, immortality is definitely not an evolution or a blessing, it's just a devastating curse. In my education, a wise man once told me that death is just the beginning of another great adventure. Really? Death is just the beginning of another great adventure? Then let me ask you, great wizard, why don't you embark on this great adventure, but instead stand on Camartage to stop my actions? In the final analysis, you are just a hypocritical coward like that woman from the Ancient One. There is no need to make excuses for yourself. All I do is save ordinary people who have been deceived by the hypocrisy of you and your group. Cassilius was not convinced by Sherlock's words. He looked at Sherlock with a mocking expression on his face, as if Sherlock really was just a hypocritical coward. Sherlock looked at the expression on Caecilius' face and slapped his forehead helplessly. It seemed that Caecilius had been brainwashed by Dormammu, otherwise how could he not hear clearly what was being said? Of course, it's because I wasn't prepared. To me, life itself is a miracle. A miracle beyond magic. We should respect the life fate has bestowed upon you. Death and life are like two equal objects on a scale. Only when both exist can the scale remain balanced. Without either, the balance is lost. Caecilius, in the face of death, I will struggle with all my might, clinging to even the slightest glimmer of hope with all my might. This is my respect for life. But when all hope is lost, I will calmly accept death and prepare for my next adventure, for this is my destiny. Forget it, I don't bother to tell you any more. Feeling irritated by Caecilius's insane thoughts, Sherlock turned and casually tossed the restraint gag that Stephen had placed on the table towards Caecilius. The moment the gag reached Caecilius, it began to transform, instantly sealing his mouth and preventing him from uttering a single word. Looking at the gagged Caecilius, Sherlock wanted to leave, but the more he thought about it, the angrier he got. He felt like he'd lost the fight, so after some thought, he decided to try and get under Caecilius' skin. With a quick thought, Sherlock came up with a plan. He turned around, squatted down in front of the mute Caecilius, and said to him with a grin, "Putting aside all those philosophies of life and death, let me tell you a truth. In a way, Dormammu can indeed grant you immortality. It's simple. As the lord of a dimension, he only needs to devour you, making you a part of him. In a sense, then, immortality is indeed granted. As for the Ancient One's hidden secret, Caecilius, if I were you, I'd take a good look in the mirror and think about why the Ancient One chose to draw energy from the dark dimension to sustain his own lifespan, rather than handing you the position of Sorcerer Supreme. Is it really because the Ancient One covets the power that comes with being a 007 for so long, specializing in solving all kinds of difficult problems? Or let me put it another way, think about it, we both draw power from Dormammu, so why does the Ancient One have a clean, white complexion, while you, my friend, have a face covered in makeup that looks like a shamet, a type of shamanic style? Seeing Caecilius's murderous look, which was due to his inability to speak, Sherlock finally felt a little better. You know what, it's really satisfying to leave your opponent speechless when you're arguing. Sherlock patted Caecilius' handsome face despite Caecilius's eyes that seemed to want to eat him alive. Then he picked up the big sword that was stuck in the ground and walked leisurely towards the trash. Chapter 514, Sherlock's Mental Disturbance. Just as Sherlock was about to disappear around the corner of the corridor, completely out of Caecilius' sight, Sherlock paused as if struck by a thought. He turned and looked at Caecilius, who was kneeling and struggling. That's right, Sherlock had decided to give Caecilius another go. Sherlock paused, turned and looked in Caecilius's direction. His free hand lifted slightly, and with Sherlock's movement, a massive book, resembling an Oxford dictionary, slowly materialized from nowhere in the air in front of him. The book then quietly hovered in front of Sherlock, seemingly awaiting his next command. Sherlock simply held the book in his hand, looked at Caecilius, who knelt beside him, and spoke slowly. Have you seen this book? It records everything I've learned throughout my life, and it contains more than one way to eternal life. The most important thing is that these ways to eternal life don't even require you to pay any price. Even if you want, this book can make you another me and have your own magic power. Dear Mr. Caecilius, as an outstanding wizard from Camartage, I think you should know what it means to have your own magic power. The most important thing is, this is a book I wrote. I can write whatever I want. Ha 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 ha. After Sherlock finished speaking, he casually threw the book in his hand into the air, and Caecilius could only watch as the book turned into ashes in midair and disappeared without a trace. And Sherlock was finally satisfied this time, especially after seeing the eager look in Caecilius's eyes when he looked at the book in his hand when he said the first half of his sentence, and the shock after hearing his last sentence. Then when he laughed, the shock in his eyes turned into anger. Unable to speak, Caecilius could only kneel on the ground in impotent rage. If the look he gave Sherlock could kill, Sherlock could have been dead 1,000 times over by now. Of course, this wasn't over yet. How could Sherlock just give up on having fun with Caecilius? After laughing for a while, Sherlock looked at Caecilius, who was clearly furious and wanted to eat him alive, and the smile on his face suddenly turned into a mocking one. Oh, you don't think I'm kidding you, do you? Sherlock said as he flipped his wrist. A fist-sized red crystal suddenly appeared in Sherlock's hand. As a fellow mage, Cassilis almost immediately sensed the immense power contained in the stone in Sherlock's hand. I never lie, huh? As a fellow mage, you can sense the power of what I hold in my hand, right? You know, this is the worst method of immortality I possess. With that, Sherlock immediately put away the Philosopher's Stone and, without hesitation, turned and disappeared from Cassilis' sight. Hearing Cassilis's roars from behind him, Sherlock's mood suddenly brightened. As for why he didn't kill Cassilis while he was immobilized, it was actually quite simple. After all, Cassilis was the Ancient One's chosen opponent for Stephen. Sherlock felt it best not to disrupt their plans. As for those small fry, neither the Ancient One nor Stephen would likely care. Stephen, in particular, would probably thank him even if he knew of the Ancient One's plan. Sherlock's happier thoughts grew, his steps becoming more brisk, and he even began to sing the praises of a happy life. Shortly after Sherlock walked down the corridor, he spotted his target, the henchman Cassilis had brought with him. At the far end of the corridor, a portal was emitting sparks. Sherlock took a quick look. What looked like a utility room on the other side. Cassilis' henchman lay motionless on the ground, but judging by the rise and fall of his belly, he was still alive. It was obvious that young people have excellent sleep quality, able to sleep so soundly even on the cold ground. Next to him lay the infamous Dr. Strange's cape. For some reason, to Sherlock, it seemed a bit, how should I put it, doggy? That's right, it was a bit doggy, and in that cowardly, doggy way. Sherlock even suspected it was because the cape didn't have a ribbon on the back, otherwise it would have been cautiously wagging its tail at him. It was just strange. Sherlock gazed at the magical cape for a moment before losing interest. With a casual stab of his sword, he plunged the recumbent underling into Dormammu's arms. Then, Sherlock unraveled his transformation. Then, with his hands in his pockets, he calmly passed through the portal and arrived on the other side. After opening the door to the storage room, Sherlock was immediately struck by the surroundings. Oh my goodness, it was a familiar place. Wasn't this the Presbyterian Hospital, also known as the First People's Hospital of New York? That's right, Tony had his butt surgery here. Sherlock had a deep impression of it. Especially every morning when the dressings were changed, Pepper, himself, and Happy would use a decibel meter to bet on whether Tony's screams would be louder than the day before. Proctology departments around the world probably looked pretty much the same. But this wasn't the proctology clinic Sherlock was familiar with. Judging by the surroundings, it looked more like an operating room. Sherlock ignored the doctor's strange looks. Despite their gazes, he briefly sensed Stephen's location and calmly walked towards the operating room. Arriving at the door, Sherlock immediately opened it, only to be struck by the sight inside, a sight that had the ever-single Sherlock reeling. Stephen, in his spirit form, was floating in midair, directing a female doctor as she performed surgery on him. The scene was bizarre, especially the bubbly atmosphere between them, which, combined with their current state, made it even stranger. It was so bizarre that Sherlock began to question his own existence. Could Stephen be a jerk? My goodness. The New York Temple's nearly breached, and you're actually dating here? And using your own body as a medium for that? Sherlock couldn't understand, but he was deeply shocked. Chapter 515 Anger from a Single Dog. Sherlock, fed a mouthful of dog food, felt utterly wrecked. Of course, that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the couple hadn't even heard Sherlock's sudden entrance into the operating room, still lost in their own world of affection. This truly sent Sherlock, a single man, reeling in a 10,000-point blow. Showing affection wasn't scary, it was the way they did it without paying attention to anyone else. Unable to bear it any longer, Sherlock gently pointed at Stephen's floating soul. Stephen's soul, whose expression was previously full of affection, froze, unable to even blink. The female doctor on the other side didn't even understand what was happening, constantly calling out Stephen's name. Sherlock couldn't bear it any longer, and with a vicious push, Stephen's soul was thrust back into Sherlock's body. The sudden change startled the female doctor, who couldn't help but let out a soft scream and took a few steps back. Before she could figure out what was happening, she saw Stephen, who had been lying on the operating table, suddenly wake up, breathe heavily, and sit up, as if a drowning person had been rescued. The movement was so great that the moment Stephen sat up, the wound he had just stitched suddenly ruptured. The intense pain even caused Stephen's face to contort. But in just a moment, Stephen realized who was causing the trouble. When he saw Sherlock leaning against the door with his arms folded, Stephen felt a little uneasy. The female doctor who followed Stephen's gaze also saw Sherlock leaning against the door and couldn't help but scream. "Oh my God, who are you? How did you get in? This is an operating room. No outsiders allowed. Christine, don't be nervous. This is my magic instructor at Camartage. My name is Sherlock. Sherlock, this is, well, my former colleague, Christine." Stephen stopped Christine, the female doctor, from trying to shoo Sherlock away. Christine was completely stunned by the sheer volume of information Stephen had just uttered. "Magic? Instructor? Camartage? Stephen, what on earth have you been doing while you've been gone?" Christine demanded, looking incredibly anxious as she began tending to Stephen's ruptured wounds. Indeed, despite witnessing Stephen's spirit and alike, Christine still harbored doubts about magic. After all, this man, a graduate of a prestigious medical school and a quintessential materialist, would have a hard time accepting the existence of magic without some concrete evidence. Sherlock ignored Christine's questioning, his face still etched with a sour, lingering feeling of love. He half smiled as he watched Christine, frantically fumbling with her stitches, and Stephen, looking pained. "Former colleagues? I think it's more than that. The atmosphere between you two was bubbling with excitement just now. Are you sure it's just former colleagues, and not some rekindled ex-girlfriend relationship?" Sherlock's words were a resounding success, making both of them blush. Christine, in particular, was particularly shy. Although American women are known for their openness, she felt shy about being teased by an outsider. Despite her shyness, she didn't stop tending to Stephen's wounds. As for Stephen, well, he was the future Sorcerer Supreme, Dr. Strange, so it was rare to see him blush. Sherlock wasn't particularly interested in their relationship, just a quick tease, and when they both fell silent, he lost interest. After all, Sherlock wasn't old enough to develop a taste for matchmaking. Although he hadn't awakened his love for matchmaking, Sherlock still wanted to investigate their recent behavior. He angrily threw a large bottle of Snape's potion at Stephen before continuing. "Use half for external use, half for internal use. Hurry, Stephen, there's a huge mess waiting for you to deal with." Looking at the potion in his hand and hearing Sherlock's words, Stephen hesitated, his grip on the flask trembling slightly. After a moment's hesitation, Stephen looked up at Sherlock. "Sherlock, do I have to do this? I'm just a doctor. I swore I wouldn't hurt anyone." After hearing Stephen's shameless remarks, Sherlock was completely upset. He rolled his eyes at Stephen before speaking. "You have two options now. First, you take the potion and come back with me. Second, I'll help you take the potion and then go ahead and take you back. Also, Dr. Christine, don't look at me like that. I'm not from Camartage. I'm just a mentor hired by his true master to teach him. Besides, shouldn't you have already thought this through? Stephen, with power comes responsibility. The greater the power, the greater the responsibility. It's a well-known fact. Don't tell me you don't know that." Didn't Stephen know? Of course he did. The main reason he was still struggling was because of the potion in his hand. After using it once, Stephen knew its powerful effects. He also knew its powerful side effects. If possible, Stephen really didn't want to use Sherlock's potion. Who knows what strange side effects it would have. Stephen couldn't even imagine how he would handle it if it were the same as last time. Fighting those wizards who had fallen into darkness with his bare ass? The scene was so beautiful that Stephen couldn't even imagine it. If there were any more Camartage mages around, he couldn't imagine what kind of gossip would spread about him. After all, his popularity at Camartage, well, everyone knows it. He already has a bunch of people trying to get him into trouble. If he messed up again, the entire Camartage community would probably be gossiping about him. What? Did Stephen drink the potion before? The difference was, it wasn't just Stephen who got embarrassed last time, his peers had also drunk it. Social demise is only for one person, not for a group. But to Stephen, Sherlock's potion was probably no different than running onto the stage at a banquet, holding a microphone, yelling, "Everyone, look at me," and then taking a huge dump on the stage. Chapter 516 Meow Girl Stephen. After a brief moment of hesitation, Stephen downed half the potion as Sherlock had instructed. As Sherlock and Christine watched, his face contorted. Sherlock remained silent, but inwardly, he was rolling with laughter. Sure enough, It was a potion crafted by Snape, even specially marked as such on the vending machines in his own kingdom. It was obvious that, given Snape's skill in potion making, he must have added ingredients to ensure a supply to the Hogwarts hospital wing. Seeing Stephen's expression, Sherlock was even more certain of the small Easter egg hidden within this HP. As for the remaining half bottle of potion, Stephen poured it directly onto his wound, just as Sherlock had instructed. The moment the potion touched his wound, Stephen began to tremble, his face turning pale as if he had been dead for a long time. But Sherlock understood. Snape could even manipulate the taste, creating an intensifying effect like this was a piece of cake for him. Christine, however, was alarmed by Stephen's unusual behavior. As a doctor in the hospital, she was deeply opposed to Stephen's use of these unidentified drugs. Especially after using the flask's contents, when Stephen's body began to tremble with pain, Christine's first impulse was to question Sherlock. However, Stephen, a fellow doctor, understood Christine's thoughts and immediately grabbed her. As Christine watched in astonishment, the wound, deep enough to reveal the bone, vanished in an instant. This miraculous scene completely shattered Christine's perspective, leaving her in a trance. WTF? Surgery doesn't exist. Seeing Christine's doubts about life, Stephen quickly tried to comfort her. Sherlock, glancing at the two men, who clearly had a special relationship, pouted and prepared to open the operating room door and leave. Just as Sherlock's hand touched the handle of the operating room door, a stifled scream echoed from behind him. Attracted by the sudden shriek, Sherlock turned his head in alarm. The sight left Sherlock speechless. Stephen's luck was truly terrible. With so many random effects, he'd only landed on the most indescribable. That's right, Stephen had transformed into a cat girl. And not just a half-orc cat girl, but the kind that would make a fan of furry cats jump for joy, like Li Bing, the protagonist of the film Dolly Temple. Her curvy figure, paired with a large, furry, white head, and hands that had transformed into cat paws, made Sherlock almost want to feel Stephen's flesh. And that was especially true for Christine, who loved furry things. The stifled scream was also due to the fact that Stephen, despite being a cat, had become adorable. Even if Christine didn't want to admit the existence of magic, the facts were stark before her, forcing her to acknowledge its existence. After all, there were only two possible reasons for the catgirl Stephen's appearance. Either the catgirl from Geon City had been pretending to be Stephen, but from their conversation before Sherlock's arrival, that was absolutely impossible. So, as Holmes said, after eliminating all the impossibilities, the remaining option, no matter how outrageous, was the truth. Christine had already largely believed all of Stephen's stories about magicians, war, and camartage. Sherlock, however, didn't care what Christine thought. Instead, he was deeply interested in Stephen's current state, observing his attributes and the magic circuits within him. The attributes were quite powerful. Cats have different anatomy than humans, but Stephen had retained not only the magic circuits of a human but also the physical qualities of a cat. Even so, Stephen was completely devastated, especially after seeing his entry and the rosy pink paw. "Stop staring at me, meow. Think about how I'm going to get back, meow. And, Christine, please stop touching my paw, meow. It feels weird, meow." Sherlock's gaze was making Stephen feel uneasy, and he tried to stop her. But the coquettish, feminine voice and the strange mannerisms in his mouth made Stephen blush. Unlike Stephen, Christine was now overflowing with maternal love. No woman could resist a large, soft-spoken cat. After Stephen stopped her, Christine regretfully gave up on rubbing Stephen's paw. Sherlock didn't seem worried at all. With a snap of his fingers, Stephen returned to his normal self, at least in Christine's eyes. Sherlock even went so far as to make Stephen's transformation and appropriate figure appear perfectly fitted, perfectly highlighting her transformed figure. Let's go. A simple illusion spell. The potion's effects can't be overridden by any other spell, except for more powerful ones. Even forcibly overriding them will have a more severe backlash. Sherlock's words sounded like a verdict to Stephen. According to Sherlock, Stephen had only two options: endure this appearance that would make Fury ecstatic for 24 hours, or try again with Sherlock's potion. Clearly unwilling to take any chances, Stephen nodded reluctantly, and, with Christine, followed Sherlock towards this portal. The moment Christine saw the portal, any remaining wariness about whether Stephen had been tricked vanished. She simply warned Stephen to be cautious and watched as he closed the portal. Meanwhile, In the New York temple, after Stephen closed the portal, the flying cloak that had identified Stephen was stunned, hesitantly moving closer to him. It couldn't understand why its chosen master, a long-faced male wizard, had returned as a woman after passing through a portal. It wouldn't have mattered if she'd just been a woman, but now, even her species had changed. Honestly, if the magic hadn't been Stephen's, the flying cloak wouldn't have recognized it as the one it had chosen. Even with the same magic, the flying cloak still hesitated to recognize her. After all, this was beyond the cloak's comprehension. It was truly too much for the cloak. Chapter 517 Mordo's XP. Stephen had already transformed into a cat Jiro, but the sight of the idiotic flying cloak irritated him for a moment. After all, the idiotic appearance of the flying cloak made it clear to anyone what this adorable, mindless creature was thinking. Stephen wasn't about to tolerate it, so he reached out and scooped up the flying cloak, placing it on his shoulders. Only when it landed squarely on Stephen's shoulders did the flying cloak finally confirm that this non-human being was truly its master. Of course, Sherlock, walking ahead, didn't notice the hiccup between Stephen and his flying cloak. Humming a little tune, he led Stephen back to where Cassilis had been held. However, when they arrived, Cassilis was nowhere to be found in the hallway. All that remained was a pile of strange restraints scattered across the floor. Sherlock was speechless as he watched the restraints break free. He'd even installed the mouthpiece Stephen hadn't installed, and yet Cassilis still managed to break free. This meant that Stephen hadn't realized it had a bug that could break free when he was using it, or rather, he simply didn't know how to use it, and must have missed some step that allowed it to break free. So, you don't know how to use it at all? No, if you don't know how to use it, how did you know it could trap Cassilis? Sherlock asked, looking at Stephen with some confusion. After all, most of the artifacts in Camartage were so bizarre. Honestly, if no one showed you how to use them, you wouldn't have figured it out on your own. Hearing Sherlock's familiar rant, Stephen's defenses snapped, and he retorted bluntly. Of course I don't know, meow. This thing was chosen by my cloak, meow. And then again, meow, you never taught me how to use it back then, meow. Hey, you little hothead. After hearing Stephen's merciless retort, Sherlock immediately rolled up his sleeves and argued with Stephen, the traitor, about respecting his teacher. Stephen didn't hold back, waving his hands, and instantly a whip gleaming with sparks appeared in his hands. However, their battle between master and disciple was interrupted before it even began. A portal suddenly appeared not far from them, and the Ancient One, leading Mordo, emerged in a hurry. Seeing the arrival of their leader, Sherlock and Stephen, in perfect unison, stopped their actions, glared at each other, and then headed towards the Ancient One. Only when they approached the Ancient One did Mordo, looking uncertainly at the cat girl, Stephen, who was following Sherlock, and ask, Stephen, stunned by Mordo's question, Stephen took a moment to react before grudgingly nodding. To everyone's surprise, Mordo actually gave Stephen a thumbs up. Keep going, Stephen. Sherlock, in particular, looked at Mordo with a strange look. Did Mordo's thumbs up just now inadvertently reveal something? Sherlock really wanted to rush over and shake Mordo awake. You've completely ruined your character, and most importantly, not only did you ruin your character, you also revealed your XP. I never thought that the normally serious mage Mordo was secretly a Fury fan. Ugh, I despise you. Mordo seemed to notice Sherlock's look, as if realizing he'd let something slip, and quickly changed the subject to make amends. I mean, Stephen, you were incredibly successful in resolving Cassilis's invasion of the New York Temple. You helped defend the honor of Camartage. It was clear that Mordo's attempt to make amends hadn't sat well with the two men, and their eyes turned even more contemptuous. Well, trolling isn't scary, but if you troll and don't admit it, that's truly terrifying. After all, they're all men, so what's wrong with a little trolling? Stephen even flung his claws out, as if to say, if you don't come up with a good excuse, I'll show you what it's like to get a rabies shot for 6 shots, costing 1,000 yuan. Seeing that things weren't going well, a flicker of panic crossed Mordo's face, but it was only then that a thought occurred to him, and he suddenly regained his composure. Mordo forced a smile, revealing his trademark black man's large white teeth, and continued to speak to Stephen, seemingly encouragingly. I didn't expect you to have the Flying Cloak's approval. Great, truly great. The Flying Cloak hasn't found a satisfactory owner in ages. Well, how should I put it? A very forced way to change the subject. After hearing Mordo's forced change of subject, Sherlock and Stephen both gave Mordo a massive eye roll in unison, then decided to ignore this hidden fury-obsessed person for now. What? The Ancient One. The Ancient One observed the interaction calmly throughout. After all, the Ancient One was so old, and Kamar Taj was right next to him. What magical things hadn't the Ancient One seen? Wasn't it just that his successor had turned into a cat girl? A minor issue, not a big deal at all. And it wasn't permanent, after all. The Ancient One had some knowledge of Sherlock's potions, and this appearance was clearly the result of using them. Stephen's clothes still bore traces of his own blood and wounds from the previous battle. The Ancient One was certain of that. What? Mordo? That doesn't matter at all. Mordo is not his successor, but just his disciple. It doesn't matter if he wants to be controlled by fury. As long as someone can keep an eye on Mordo and prevent him from being as weird as the third brother next door, that's enough. Ancient One said that he fully respects and understands the XP of all his disciples. Of course, playing around aside, Ancient One still didn't forget about a serious business. He looked at Stephen, who had turned into a cat girl, with satisfaction and said in a gentle tone, "Stephen, you successfully stopped Cassilis from destroying the New York Temple. But you know, in order to prevent external invasions, the temple cannot be left unguarded for a day, so I would like to invite you to become the new guardian of the New York Temple." What Ancient One never expected was that just after he finished speaking, Stephen, who had turned into a cat girl, rejected Ancient One's proposal without any hesitation. "I'm sorry, I refuse, meow." Chapter 518, Mordo and Stephen were scolded. What? Both Mordo and the Ancient One were stunned by Stephen's rejection. Neither had expected Stephen to reject them so decisively. Stephen, a bit overwhelmed, addressed the Ancient One directly. "I said I refuse, meow. I swore an oath when I became a doctor, meow, never to let a single life perish before my eyes, meow. I swore an oath, meow. And don't think I don't know about your little secret with Cassilis, meow. I've read that book, meow. I saw the contents of those 2 pages Cassilis tore, meow, using this to see it, meow." Stephen spoke, pointing to the eye of Agamotto, which hung on his chest. He looked quite hysterical, especially after witnessing the madness of Cassilis and the others. Unexpectedly, after Stephen's words, the first person to break down wasn't the Ancient One, but Mordo, who was standing beside the Ancient One. Although Stephen's words were in line with his long-hidden XP, Mordo sided with the Ancient One without hesitation when it came to his beliefs. "How dare you? Do you know what the Ancient One has been through? How dare you, a coward who only cares about saving yourself, speak to the Ancient One like that?" Stephen, already furious, didn't care. His large cat-like eyes, the pupils nearly slitted, stared intently at Mordo, who was lashing out at him. "Really? Coward? Are you talking about me, meow? I'm a mage who's only been in Kamar Taj for less than 6 months, and I faced a master mage who's fallen into darkness, meow. I defeated him and saved the New York sanctuary, meow. You call me a coward? Well, meow, when I was fighting for my life, meow, even personally dispatching an enemy, meow, what on earth were you doing, meow?" Stephen was already furious. Because of the unique quirks of his speech, influenced by the entry, and the soft, catgirl voice, even though he was cursing, he somehow felt like he was being coquettish. It wasn't just Sherlock who felt this way, even Mordo, who was currently leaning against Stephen, felt the same way. It felt like he'd punched cotton, and for a moment, Mordo wasn't sure if he should continue his anger and sparring with Stephen. Enough. Just as the two were arguing, Sherlock finally couldn't contain his anger and roared at them. He didn't know why, but ever since Sherlock had let Cassilis, the one that Ancient One had left for Stephen to practice with, he'd been feeling a surge of anger. Now, amidst the two's quarrel, Sherlock felt like his head was about to explode. Unable to suppress the rage that was growing stronger and stronger, he roared at them. "Enough, Stephen, you didn't kill anyone. Except for Cassilis, all the little brothers he brought were killed by me. If you don't believe me, you can go and check the bodies. What's more, this is a war. You can't never kill the enemy. Remember what I said. The greater the ability, the greater the responsibility. Stephen, you can't enjoy the magic of magic while escaping the responsibility brought to you by magic. What's more, you can't escape. The ultimate goal of Dormammu, the Lord of Darkness behind Cassilis, is to devour the earth. Let the earth and everyone fall into darkness. This is his goal. Think about your girlfriend in the hospital. Think about the ordinary people in this world. All of them are waiting for your rescue. Otherwise, who do you expect to stand up? The Avengers. Sherlock paused when he said this, and a sarcastic expression appeared on his face. He looked at Stephen, who didn't dare to say a word because of what he said, and continued. Are you counting on Tony in his armor to fight the magic, or Captain America's shield? Maybe the Hulk's fists? No, no, no. How about Hawkeye's bow and arrow? If that doesn't work, try having Natasha seduce Dormammu. Stephen, utterly defeated by Sherlock's rant, lost his earlier defensive demeanor. Sherlock's words made sense, and Stephen couldn't find a single flaw. This was Kamartaj's responsibility. No matter how powerful the Avengers were, they couldn't cross over to aid him in the fight. He was just as Sherlock had said, enjoying the wonder and power of magic while simultaneously trying to evade his responsibilities. What Stephen hadn't anticipated was that after Sherlock had finished blasting him, Mordo on the other side wasn't immune either. And you, Mordo. I know you respect the Ancient One, but you have to know that the Ancient One is just a person, a powerful wizard, nothing more. Don't deify her, and don't take a powerful person as your faith. Similarly, don't impose your ideas on the Ancient One. If a wizard more powerful than the Ancient One appears, will you still change your faith? Damn it, the Ancient One is just a person who makes mistakes, has emotions, thoughts, and hobbies. He is not the omnipotent, infallible God you imagine. Know your place. You are just the Ancient One's disciple, not his believer. The Ancient One never needs any believers. After being scolded by Sherlock, Mordo was stunned for a moment, not knowing what to say. Sherlock ignored the two people who were stunned and directly opened a portal behind him and spoke to the Ancient One. Do you have time to talk, Master Ancient One? I have something that I need your help with. The Ancient One had been stunned by Stephen's words, but after Sherlock's outburst, a smile returned to his face. Hearing Sherlock's invitation, he finally nodded. Before following Sherlock through the portal, he glanced at the two men standing there, lost in thought. With a helpless sigh, he addressed them. Whatever you think, do what you believe is right. Believe in yourselves and follow your heart. Without hesitation, the Ancient One stepped through the portal and left with Sherlock. The moment the portal closed, Mordo and Stephen were the only ones left in the New York Temple. They exchanged awkward glances, unsure of what to say. But soon, there was no need for conversation, for soon after Sherlock and the Ancient One left, the entire New York Temple began to violently shake. Mordo, an elder of Kamartaj, immediately understood what was happening. Oh no! Cassilis is back. They're destroying the core of the New York Temple. We must stop them. He then rushed out towards the entrance hall. Stephen rolled his eyes at Mordo and followed him out. Sherlock was right. Even if he didn't want to participate in the war, what about Christine? What about those innocent people? In times of danger, someone always has to stand up, right? Chapter 519 Sherlock was tricked. Meanwhile, Sherlock and the Ancient One weren't as nervous as Stephen and Mordo. No, to be more precise, they were more relaxed. Although they had left through the portal, they hadn't actually gone far, confined to a coffee shop across from the New York Temple. The moment the portal opened, Sherlock cast a powerful confusion charm, oblivious to their unusual behavior. No one noticed their unusual behavior until they sat down and ordered their coffee. The Ancient One surveyed the crowd, seemingly oblivious to them, and took a leisurely sip of his coffee before sighing. Your magic is quite convenient in some ways, even comparable to the Reality Stone. Hearing the Ancient One's sentiment, Sherlock's lips twitched, and for a moment, he wasn't sure how to respond. After all, what the Ancient One had said was true. HP's magic did have a separate branch of life magic, and there were quite a few of them. What would the Ancient One's expression be if he knew he could perform nearly any household task with magic? Of course, Sherlock was just thinking about it, not actually putting it into action. After all, compared to these seemingly illicit pursuits, his own emotional issues were undoubtedly more important. Master Ancient One, Sherlock wasn't finished when Ancient One interrupted him. With a smirk on his face, he took over. Your mood took a turn for the worse when you saw Caecilius. And after you let Caecilius go because of Stephen, you felt this inexplicable rage that you couldn't contain, right, Sherlock? Sherlock looked at Ancient One, sitting across from him, puzzled, even glancing at his chest. There was no time stone anymore? If Sherlock remembered correctly, the Eye of Agamotto should be with Stephen. How the hell did Ancient One seem to have the time stone now? Could it be that, having worn the time stone for so long, he had acquired some of its powers? He'd never heard of infinity stones leaving any side effects. How else could he explain Ancient One knowing what he was about to say before he'd even finished speaking? This isn't even science or magic. Seeing Sherlock's expression of doubt, the Ancient One's smile widened, and he gently tapped the table to attract Sherlock's attention. The sound of the Ancient One's knocking brought Sherlock's thoughts, which had nearly drifted to the Alpha Centauri system, back to the table. He nodded quickly and continued. Yes, that's right. It's like I've just let go of a spider that's landed on my bed. Every time I think about going to sleep at night, I can't help but get mad. That's how it feels. Sherlock hesitated and frantically formed words to describe his feelings. His words became fragmented as he continued to think, but the Ancient One didn't mind at all. He calmly picked up his coffee and drank it while Sherlock described his feelings. After listening to Sherlock's description, the Ancient One calmly put down his coffee and spoke to Sherlock. This is normal, Sherlock. You are the Lord of the Dimension born on Earth. Do you know what this means? Sherlock looked at Ancient One in confusion, as if waiting for an explanation. What else could it mean? Of course, it means that his power has become stronger. What else could it mean? As if he saw Sherlock's confusion, Ancient One smiled and explained to Sherlock. It's not what you think. Do you know how Dimension Lords like Dormammu and Mephisto were born? It's actually very simple. Initially, they were pretty much like you. On almost every civilized planet, individuals like you appear every once in a while. But often, these individuals never even reach death without the chance to establish their own kingdoms. Apparently, Dormammu and Mephisto were lucky enough to open their own kingdoms by chance. This was the turning point for all Dimension Lords. The world of the Dark Dimension is one where the strong reign, and the powerful can devour the weak at any moment. So, without the slightest hesitation, Dormammu brought his kingdom to his planet, then transformed into true Dimension Lord, and began to devour and wander the universe. As for Mephisto, he was similar to Dormammu, except that in the demonic world, the powerful have absolute dominance over the weak. So, under such a climate of natural selection, Mephisto didn't hesitate to bring his kingdom to hell. For any dimensional master possessing a kingdom, the planet that gave birth to them is essentially their territory, and also the best soil for their kingdom's growth. So naturally, the presence of Caecilius, a dark dimension resident, on Earth makes you feel as though your territory has been invaded. Now it's your turn to choose. I've seen your kingdom and know everything within it. Now it's up to you. Are you willing to shoulder the fate of nearly 7 billion people on Earth and become a true dimensional master? Once you've accomplished the necessary kingdom's arrival, the mutual influence between your kingdom and Earth will cause both Dormammu and Mephisto to cease their invasions. After all, war between dimensions is not the same as simply devouring an unknown planet. So, will you consider it, Sherlock? No. I refuse. Sherlock refused without hesitation. Even a second of hesitation would have been disrespectful to Sherlock's vain dreams. If he truly brought his kingdom to Earth, the myriad creatures within it alone would be enough to give Sherlock a headache. After all, even in HP's original world, many magical creatures had been hunted to near extinction by wizards due to their inherent characteristics. As for ordinary humans learning of their existence, Sherlock couldn't even think about it. And most importantly, if he really agreed to the Ancient One, what difference would that make him taking over the position of Sorcerer Supreme? Being Sorcerer Supreme was still a 007 job, but if he truly became the Lord of a dimension, wouldn't he be the boss? And the boss of a small business, the kind where he'd have to do everything himself. Sherlock's scalp tingled at the mere thought of it. Even now, he felt a bit of a headache. After all, Earth was his territory, and Sherlock felt he had to take good care of Camartage, so that these people would work for him and protect the entire planet. Wait. As Sherlock thought about this, he suddenly felt something was wrong. It seemed like no matter which choice he made, it wouldn't be right. If the Kingdom of God arrived, he would have to step up and take care of Earth. If it didn't, he would have to take care of Camartage. Shit. Got cheated. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 520, Naughty Ancient One. After realizing what was happening, Sherlock looked at Ancient One with a look filled with resentment, as if to say, "How dare you, you thick-browed, big-eyed fellow, have such sinister intentions? You're so old, yet you're actually trying to trick a young man like me. You have no moral composure." Meanwhile, Ancient One calmly sipped his coffee under Sherlock's resentful gaze. Yes, Ancient One had played a trick on Sherlock. But this was the path Sherlock was meant to take, wasn't it? Ancient One had simply used his status to slightly increase the stakes. And it was precisely because Sherlock understood this that he felt so frustrated. If you say Ancient One was playing tricks on him, then this was the path he was meant to take, and Ancient One had simply accelerated the process. But if you say Ancient One wasn't playing tricks on him, then he did have a little ulterior motive, but it was harmless. This left Sherlock feeling very uncomfortable. For a moment, he didn't know what to say, and could only silently add a note to his mental grudge against Ancient One. After a while, Sherlock managed to calm himself down, looking at the Ancient One with a complex expression. What Sherlock didn't know was that the Ancient One hadn't told him everything. After all, he had long anticipated that Sherlock wouldn't bring his kingdom to Earth. The Dimension Lord's kingdom was actually a truly mysterious entity. Bringing it to Earth, as the Ancient One had said, was a relatively simple method. There was also a much more difficult method, diligently cultivating his kingdom. Once it could support a true dimension, Sherlock would become a Dimension Lord like Dormammu or Mephisto. Furthermore, the power gained through this method was often far greater than that achieved through trickery, as Dormammu and Mephisto achieved through opportunistic means. Just look at the Trinity, Vishanti. Vishanti was once a mere mage on Earth, but now he was a renowned figure throughout the universe, a figure even Dormammu and Mephisto wouldn't dare to provoke. The disparity in power existed even among Dimension Lords. Of course, as an old man who had lived for who knows how long, the Ancient One was quite knowledgeable. She had left behind a number of backup plans to ensure Sherlock would fully understand the power of the so-called Lord of Dimensions after her departure. As for her current statement, well, the Ancient One admitted that on the one hand, it was indeed her own mischievousness at work, and on the other, it was just one last attempt to get Sherlock to take over the responsibility of protecting the Earth. The two of them just stared at each other in silence in the cafe. Sherlock looked at the Ancient One thoughtfully, while the Ancient One calmly sipped his coffee. The awkward silence between the two was interrupted by a powerful burst of magical energy from the nearby New York Temple. After sensing the magical energy, before Sherlock could say anything, he saw Meow Girl Stephen and Mordo running out of the New York Temple in a mirror space. Meanwhile, Stephen's face wore an unnatural expression, as if he'd been teased. Even from such a distance, Stephen's cat still had thick fur on its face, and Sherlock could see a slight blush on his face. Then, as Sherlock watched in astonishment, the entire city of New York began to distort under Cassilis's hands, like the movie Inception beamed into reality. Of course, this was a mirror dimension after all. So even Cassilis's distortions couldn't affect the real world. Before entering the mirror dimension, both the Ancient One and Sherlock could only watch. Still, distorting the entire city of New York at once was quite an exaggeration. Sherlock's mouth twitched. As the figures began to tumble and fly further and further away, Sherlock, somewhat dazed, turned to the Ancient One and asked, "Are you sure that Stephen and Mordo right now can defeat Cassilis, who can warp the entirety of New York? It seems a bit far-fetched to me." The Ancient One sighed softly and said to Sherlock, "I was confident originally, but it's undeniable that both Stephen and Mordo made a poor move. Cassilis was already incredibly proficient in the magic of the Mirror Realm during his time at Camartage, and even more so after being empowered by Dormammu's dark magic. The two of them chose to drag Cassilis and the others into the Mirror Realm, undoubtedly exploiting their own weaknesses to exploit their strengths." After hearing the Ancient One's words, Sherlock's mouth twitched slightly. Sherlock was already regretting not explaining the importance of intelligence when teaching Stephen. Why had he forgotten to offer an intelligence course? He had spent much of his 7 years at the training grounds learning intelligence gathering with his 5 uncles. But now, it was clear that Sherlock didn't have time to regret. The most important thing now was to clean up Stephen's mess. Don't think the old-fashioned trope of beating the younger isn't prevalent in the Western world, or even in the Marvel universe. Honestly, as long as there's still family ties, beating the younger and calling the older ones is universally applicable. I can't say anything else, but if Tony's father were still alive, and if he knew about the Captain and Winter Soldier 2-on-1 situation in Civil War, Howard would definitely have gone to Captain and the Winter Soldier with a nuclear bomb to have a proper conversation. What the hell, two uncles beating up their own nephew? And you still have the nerve to tell anyone about it? If you two don't give me an explanation today, I'll detonate a nuclear bomb right here and there, and we'll all perish together. This wasn't an exaggeration. Remember, in Sherlock's original memory, when he was bullied as a child, it was Sherlock's 5 uncles who stood up for him, fiercely threatening the fat kid with guns. Although Tony didn't say anything, he secretly destroyed the company of the fat boy's father who bullied him, which was a way for Sherlock to vent his anger. However, Sherlock thought of countless ways for the Ancient One to stand up for Stephen, but he never expected the Ancient One's way of traveling to be so unexpected. After watching Stephen and Mordo escape from the New York Temple and Cassilis and his group of minions chasing them, the Ancient One calmly drank the coffee in one gulp. Then, under Sherlock's astonished gaze, he walked to the side of the road and hailed a taxi. He even waved at Sherlock to follow. The Ancient One? Take a taxi? WTF. Sherlock felt his neck itch, as if he was about to grow a brain. Chapter 521, Ancient One Skills. The Sorcerer Supreme of Camartage, the most powerful wizard on Earth, chased his enemies by taking a taxi? Each of these words sounded perfectly normal, but when combined, Sherlock felt his CPU was practically smoking, unable to process the situation. For some reason, Sherlock felt the scene before him resembled Harry Potter's trip to Ollivander's to buy a wand, only for Ollivander to produce a pistol upon Harry's entrance. Fortunately, even though Sherlock's mind didn't register, his body still walked towards the taxi. Even after Sherlock and the Ancient One were in the back seat of the taxi, he still felt a strong desire to complain. As the most famous Sorcerer Supreme in the universe, Ancient One, even running would be perfectly fitting for you, let alone using some outlandish magic. But taking a taxi really makes it seem like your character is being torn apart. However, Sherlock wasn't prepared for something even more devastating. After confirming Sherlock's arrival, Ancient One, seated behind the driver's seat, gently waved his hands, and several sparkling magic sigils appeared in his hands. Before Sherlock could react, he suddenly slammed the sigils onto the driver's seat. As Sherlock watched in astonishment, the driver, who had been about to inquire about their destination, suddenly froze in his tracks. He silently shifted gears, stepped on the accelerator, and began to drive forward at a leisurely pace. After this, Ancient One skillfully pulled a green $100 bill from his sleeve and tossed it directly at the driver. The whole process seemed fluid, clearly not his first time. As if noticing Sherlock's gaze, Ancient One looked at Sherlock, seated beside him, with amusement and asked, "What's wrong? Is there a problem?" Sherlock's face nearly flushed red after hearing the Ancient One's question. After brainstorming for a while, he looked at the Ancient One beside him and asked, "Is Camartage a legitimate magical organization?" Hearing Sherlock's nonsensical question, the Ancient One rolled his eyes at Sherlock, and Sherlock could only scratch his butt awkwardly. It felt awkward, like playing a joke right in front of someone who didn't know. But Sherlock soon accepted the Ancient One's playful behavior. Partly because Sherlock remembered that the Ancient One wasn't some serious old-fashioned old man. After all, just look at the movie where Dr. Banner went to New York to fight and asked the Ancient One for the Time Stone. While the Avengers were fighting the aliens, the Ancient One was calmly lounging on the roof of the New York Temple, wearing sunglasses and basking in the sun. If Sherlock remembered correctly, there was even a cocktail next to him. It was like watching a movie live. Who knows if Banner had cast some magic before his arrival, hoping to get a closer look. On the other hand, Sherlock understood why the Ancient One had taken a taxi. While the movie showed Stephen and Mordo, chasing Cassilis and his minions, whirling and leaping across New York, seemingly covering a vast distance, it was a movie after all, and with the aid of the mirror dimension, the two didn't actually get very far before being trapped by Cassilis's young mirror dimension. After all, with Cassilis's ability to manipulate the mirror dimension, it's entirely possible to travel all day in the mirror dimension, yet in reality, you'd only cover about a meter. So, despite the Ancient One and Sherlock's taxi traveling at a steady pace of just over 30 miles per hour, even encountering red lights and minor traffic jams, they still easily caught up with Stephen and his group. After the two men exited the car, Sherlock could clearly sense that Stephen and Mordo combined were no match for Caecilius and his minions. Caecilius, the Overlord, didn't even need to intervene. Simply manipulating the mirror dimension with his aid would have rendered the two helpless. Seeing this, the Ancient One, without a word, instantly launched himself into the air and entered the mirror dimension. After the Ancient One departed, Sherlock could only sense their positions. Any hope of seeing what was happening within the mirror dimension was impossible. Sherlock's first reaction wasn't that the Ancient One had abandoned him, but rather, oh no. That old guy is running. Indeed, despite the film's abrupt demise, many netizens joked that the cause was expensive special effects, even becoming a meme about the Camartage wizards. But Sherlock knew that the Ancient One wasn't dead at all. For a wizard of their caliber, even if the body dies, the soul doesn't actually report to the death realm. Especially for a powerful figure like the Ancient One, he likely fled to Vishanti to enjoy a carefree life. Sherlock could understand why the Ancient One chose death over continuing as Camartage's Sorcerer Supreme. On the one hand, centuries of 007 life had worn the Ancient One down, and he wanted to let go and rest. On the other hand, over these centuries, the Ancient One had noticed a subtle religious trend within Camartage. Mordo was a prime example. Though he didn't say it, he already viewed the Ancient One as an omnipotent god. This wasn't a good sign. There shouldn't be any so-called religion in Camartage. Of course, there's another, more crucial reason. After all, the Ancient One's lifespan is sustained by stealing the power of Dormammu from the Dark Dimension. Regardless, as Camartage's arch-enemy, Dormammu's continued position as Sorcerer Supreme would be inappropriate if his actions were discovered. After all, it's important for people to bear the consequences of their mistakes, no matter what legitimate reasons they were based on. But the Ancient One clearly overlooked one thing: Sherlock. How could Sherlock, who had just been tricked by the Ancient One into protecting Earth, allow the Ancient One to go off and enjoy life with Vishanti? Haha, how could that be possible? Chapter 522, Death of Ancient One, Part 1. Seeing the Ancient One rush into the mirror dimension, Sherlock, without hesitation, drew his wand and cast a confusion charm, disregarding passers-by. He then immediately began to dismantle the mirror dimension. Though Sherlock knew the magic of the mirror dimension, after all, the magic wasn't of the same origin. He couldn't easily enter a mirror dimension like the Ancient One. The mirror dimension itself was a mysterious magic. Its opening and closing could only be controlled by the user. However, within the mirror dimension, whether it was spatial distortion or anything else, it was governed by the principle of whoever was stronger. This was precisely why Caecilius pursued Stephen so desperately. After all, if Stephen didn't dispel the magic of the mirror dimension, even if Caecilius could manipulate it, he wouldn't be able to escape Stephen's mirror dimension. There are only two ways to break the mirror space: Stephen's own initiative to disable it, or simply killing Stephen. At this point, the control over the mirror space's opening and closing is transferred to the true operator within the mirror space. This is precisely why, despite its usefulness, many Camartage mages are extremely cautious about it, often opting for melee combat even when they could use it. After all, if both the mages and the enemy are within the mirror space, and the mages lose control of the mirror space, their use of the mirror space could become the catalyst for their own demise. After learning the details of this magic, Sherlock was incredibly critical of it, and reasonably suspected it was a designation by the original scriptwriters to save money on special effects. Of course, this stipulation was completely unnecessary for the Ancient One. After all, across the entire Earth, there were very few beings who could have been as immersed in magic for centuries as the Ancient One. Even Caecilius, possessing the power of darkness, couldn't compete with the Ancient One for access to the mirror dimension. For this reason, the Ancient One immediately began manipulating the mirror dimension to counterattack Caecilius upon entering it. In the Ancient One's hands, the mirror dimension magic, once merely a supporting tool, transformed into combined offensive and defensive power, leaving Caecilius and his companions in a state of panic. Meanwhile, as the Ancient One exerted his full power, a Dormammu symbol appeared on his forehead. This symbol forcibly imprinted the dark power upon those who drew upon the power of the dark dimension. Stephen didn't react to this, having already read about it in his magic book and guessed at the Ancient One's longevity. Mordo, on the other hand, was a different story. Seeing the symbol on the Ancient One's forehead, signifying the power of the dark dimension, Mordo felt a sense of shattered faith. He stumbled, as if ready to fall, his eyes filled with disbelief. No. No. It's not like this. It shouldn't be like this, Mordo kept muttering, looking as if it was his first day meeting the Ancient One. Just as Mordo was about to retreat to the edge of the platform, about to fall off, a large hand suddenly slammed down on Mordo's shoulder. It was Sherlock. Sherlock looked a bit disheveled, as if he had just gotten out of bed, his expression a blur. It wasn't Sherlock's fault. After all, after the Ancient One entered the mirror dimension, control of the entire mirror dimension shifted to him, making Sherlock's cracking process incredibly difficult. His swift entry into the mirror dimension was only possible thanks to Sherlock's long accumulation of magic and his overwhelming advantage as the Lord of the Dimension. However, Mordo clearly didn't care how much effort Sherlock had put into entering the mirror dimension. The moment he saw Sherlock, Mordo grabbed Sherlock's shoulder as if he had found a lifeline. "Tell me, Master Sherlock, what I saw was all an illusion, right? As Dormammu's #1 enemy, Master Ancient One would definitely not be the kind of person who secretly absorbs dark power to maintain his own life, right? Tell me." Sherlock, who originally wanted to go up to help, was stopped by Mordo. Looking at Mordo's almost crazy persistence, Sherlock was also furious, and slapped Mordo in the face with a big dice. "Wake up. I've already told you, Mordo, don't take the Ancient One as your faith. She's just an ordinary wizard, a human, not the omnipotent god in your heart. Instead of worrying about whether the Ancient One is using the power of the Dark Dimension to maintain her lifespan, you might as well think about why the Ancient One did that instead of passing the position of Sorcerer Supreme to you or someone else. Don't tell me any other nonsense reasons. Think about it, after Caecilius left, you were immersed in the management of Camartage. How long has it been since you went to the library to read a magic book? Think about it again. If you are sitting in the Ancient One's position, looking at the lack of successors, would you be confident in handing over the responsibility of protecting the Earth to someone like you? Have you lived like a dog at such an old age? This world has never been black and white, but a touch of exquisite gray. Even high school graduates know this. Don't tell me you don't know. Even if the Ancient One really absorbed the power of darkness to maintain his own lifespan, I dare to believe that the Ancient One did not fall into darkness. Just look at Caecilius and his group. So now, let me go." "Trash." Sherlock spoke at Mordo at an extremely fast speed, and there was no thought of leaving any room for maneuver in his words. Mordo was scolded so directly that he was a little dazed. Seeing that Mordo still looked not very fresh, and Caecilius on the other side was already fighting with Ancient One, Sherlock no longer cared about what Mordo was thinking. He went up and slapped Mordo hard, knocking the dazed Mordo to the ground. Seeing that the people who tried to stop him were gone, he picked up his wand and rushed towards Caecilius and Ancient One. But it was obvious that Sherlock was still a step slow. Sherlock had just raised his wand when he saw Caecilius, with the help of his younger brother's body, directly stab the transparent space knife into Ancient One's chest. In an instant, everyone present was dumbfounded. The entire battlefield became so quiet that you could hear a pin drop. No one could believe that the powerful Sorcerer Supreme, who had protected the Earth for hundreds of years and whom even Odin of Asgard had to treat with courtesy, had died so hastily in front of everyone. Chapter 523, Death of Ancient One, Part 2. The entire battlefield was so quiet you could hear a pin drop, as if everyone was frozen in time, Sherlock included. Even Caecilius himself was in disbelief, glancing at his own hands with a hint of doubt. The master who had once called him omnipotent and godlike had died in his own hands? Caecilius couldn't quite believe he could actually do this, and he even dispelled the magic of the dimensional blade. Without the support of the transparent dimensional blade, the Ancient One's body fell like a rag doll, tumbling down the edge of the platform he had contorted within the mirrored space. Due to gravity, the Ancient One, now devoid of both magic and life, fell directly out of the mirrored space, shattering glass buildings like a real corpse before landing on the street, drawing a wave of gasps from the innocent muggles. Watching the muggles below, some calling the police, others watching the excitement, even if the crowd refused to admit it, the truth was clear, the Ancient One was indeed dead. Caecilius glanced at the stunned Stephen, Mordo, and Sherlock, who seemed still unaware of the situation. He silently turned, opened a portal, and departed. After Caecilius left, Sherlock seemed to react as well. He glanced coldly at Mordo and Stephen before disappearing in an instant. Beside the Ancient One's corpse, amidst the clamor of a crowd, a male voice calmly addressed the people around him. "How does it feel to witness your own death?" The person next to the male voice smiled faintly, and a pleasant female voice began. "Are you being honest? That's a bit sloppy. Sherlock, you're definitely not a good screenwriter." That was the person who spoke, the corpse lying on the ground, the Ancient One. Upon hearing the Ancient One's words, Sherlock couldn't help but burst out laughing. After a moment, he managed to regain his composure under the Ancient One's strange gaze and spoke to him. "Well, you're right. If this scene were made into a movie, it would definitely be panned by audiences. Let me think. The reason might be that the special effects are too expensive." After hearing Sherlock's answer, the smile on Ancient One's face widened. Glancing at the crowd around them, who completely ignored them, and the cars with flashing red and blue lights approaching, a hint of worry crossed his face. "Is it okay to leave my body here like this?" Ancient One said to Sherlock, gesturing at the approaching vehicles. After hearing Ancient One's concern, Sherlock's face shifted to a look of distress, and after a moment, he managed to recover and spoke to Ancient One. "Don't worry, with my transfiguration and the illusion magic I learned in Asgard, these muggles won't notice anything amiss. It's just another number on the list of nameless corpses." Sherlock's distress deepened as he spoke, looking at the Ancient One's corpse on the ground with growing regret. After a moment, he shook his head and continued. "It's a pity I've been raising live pigs in the kingdom of God for so long. God knows how hard it is to find a live pig here in the Eagle Sauce. It took me ages to find one. I was thinking of making a proper pig-killing meal once this matter was over." Hearing Sherlock's regret, the Ancient One rolled his eyes at him in annoyance. After a moment, as if remembering something, he spoke to Sherlock. "Sherlock, I don't understand. You should be able to see what I'm thinking. I don't understand why you went to such lengths to stop me." After hearing the Ancient One's complaint, Sherlock's expression suddenly became strange. His mind reeled from Stephen's subsequent, infuriating actions. After a moment, he addressed the Ancient One with a complex expression. "Just think of it as you've screwed me so many times, so I'll screw you this time. You must live, or it'll be hard for anyone else to clean up that bastard Stephen. At least until Stephen learns to behave himself, you must live." Sherlock's mind was filled with Stephen's ambiguous finger gesture during the final battle, unsure whether it meant Tony to fly upwards or snap his fingers. And then there was the subsequent chaos Stephen had caused in No Returns. While it had led to the iconic trio of Spider-Man, it ultimately caused everyone to forget Spider-Man. Sherlock couldn't accept that. Spider-Man was one of Tony's destined successors after his death. As a spectator, Sherlock felt as if this scene completely wiped out the last bit of Tony's spark in the world. Regardless, Sherlock was deeply repulsed by such an outcome. With the Ancient One around, he could at least clean up Stephen's mess, right? Seeing Sherlock's increasingly complex expression, the Ancient One froze for a moment, somewhat bewildered, unable to understand how Sherlock, without the time stone, could know the future. However, having clearly shed Camartage and his position as Sorcerer Supreme, the Ancient One didn't want to understand further. He simply faced the situation head-on. After a comfortable stretch, the Ancient One addressed Sherlock. "Well, after all, I finally stepped down from my position as Sorcerer Supreme during 007's working hours, and I don't have to worry about Camartage anymore. So, dear Mr. Sherlock, would you be willing to give an unknown wandering mage like me a lighter job?" After hearing the Ancient One's words, Sherlock's mind was almost overwhelmed by the urge to complain. "Hey, you know the Sorcerer Supreme's job is 007, right? You knew it was 007's working hours, so why did you keep inviting me? Do you really think I'm a fool? And what the hell is a wandering mage?" For some reason, when Sherlock heard those words, the first image that popped into his mind was Riz, one of League of Legends' 3 newbie heroes. But you know what? Apart from the gender and skin color, the Ancient One's bald head and Riz do bear a resemblance. After a long effort, Sherlock barely suppressed his urge to complain, rolling his eyes at the Ancient One standing beside him. "Of course, but before that, are you interested in watching the live-action movie The Birth of the Negotiator with me?" Chapter 524, Watching the Birth of the Negotiator Up Close. What? Why was the Ancient One so cheerfully chatting with Sherlock when he was clearly killed by Caecilius in front of everyone? The story begins with Sherlock's entry into the mirror dimension. In full view of Stephen, Mordo, and Caecilius, Sherlock's first act upon entering the mirror dimension was to persuade Mordo, whose faith had collapsed. But that was all just a magical illusion created by Sherlock. The truth was, Sherlock, as the Lord of the Dimension, immediately seized control of the mirror dimension from the Ancient One, leveraging his status as Lord of the Dimension. This explains why the Ancient One abandoned his control of the mirror dimension and engaged in physical combat with Caecilius and the others. Sherlock's first action upon taking control of the mirror dimension was to use illusions and transfiguration to completely cover the battlefield, and without hesitation, he immediately disarmed the Ancient One. Of course, to Caecilius, Stephen, Mordo, and the others, the Ancient One was still fighting, and was dominating Caecilius and his minions. And Sherlock, having immediately freed the Ancient One from the fray, immediately cast a petrification spell upon him. As the Sorcerer Supreme, the Ancient One experienced Sherlock's magic firsthand. And the impression he had of Sherlock's magic was simply overwhelming. Indeed, Sherlock's magic, having ascended to the rank of Lord of the Dimension, was truly overwhelming. Even someone as powerful as the Ancient One was powerless under Sherlock's spell. What happened next was relatively simple. Sherlock orchestrated a scenario reminiscent of the film, and under the Ancient One's perplexed gaze, he disguised his own corpse with a live pig he kept in the kingdom of God. He even orchestrated his own plot to make it seem as if it had just happened, staging a complete deception before everyone's eyes, faking the Ancient One's death. Initially baffled, the Ancient One eventually came to terms with the situation, maintaining his utmost trust in Sherlock. This trust proved to be true. After readily agreeing to watch the live-action adaptation of The Negotiator with Sherlock, Sherlock and the Ancient One quietly followed Stephen and Mordo. If Sherlock truly wanted to hide, not only Stephen and Mordo, but even Dormammu would have difficulty detecting Sherlock. The two, wearing sunglasses, sat on a large, movable sofa with legs, each holding a large bucket of popcorn and a Coke, watching with relish the fall of the New York and Hong Kong temples. They witnessed Old Wang, Stephen, and Mordo desperately trying to save the temple, but to no avail. Ultimately, Mordo, driven by a collapse of faith and the reshaping of his perspective by Sherlock, chose to leave Camartage. The remaining Old Wang and Stephen were no match for Caecilius, ultimately forcing Stephen to use the power of the Time Stone. Using the Time Stone even gave Stephen a bold idea. It was this idea that gave rise to the most talked about Marvel movie, The Negotiator. The Ancient One and Sherlock were so amused by Stephen and Dormammu that their stomachs ached. After all, who could have imagined that the arrogant Lord of the Dark Dimension would be so annoyed that he would give up invading Earth? Even the Ancient One admitted that he had never considered this move. If he had known it would solve the problem once and for all, he would have done it long ago, and there would have been no need to fight Dormammu to death. Sherlock even counted and found that Stephen had died a total of 5,237 times. Indeed, Dormammu killed Stephen 5,237 different times. Stephen's spirit is remarkably resilient, having died over 5,000 times and still remaining conscious. It only makes sense that the Ancient One chose him as the Sorcerer Supreme. The only noteworthy point is perhaps Dormammu's appearance. In the film, Dormammu appears as a large, undulating, misty head. But in reality, Dormammu isn't as attractive as in the film. While it still has a large head, a closer look reveals it's composed of countless grotesque, corpse-like structures. No, calling them corpses isn't quite accurate, they're more like souls. These structures, forming Dormammu's head, not only don't look as beautiful as in the film, but they also give off a tinge of sanity. Sherlock couldn't understand how Dormammu, with just this appearance, could have so completely ensnared Caecilius. After all, any human who saw Dormammu's face would know he was no good. It was the Ancient One who explained to Sherlock the question that had been puzzling him. First, there was Dormammu's dark dimension. If the name were taken literally, it would be pitch black, devoid of any light. But in reality, of all the dimensions of the Lord of Dimensions, Dormammu's dark dimension was arguably the most beautiful, a fact Sherlock acknowledged. Who could have imagined Dormammu's dark dimension would be so vibrantly colorful? It was like being in a dreamlike universe, awash in vibrant colors, even more beautiful than the universe humans longed for. The appearance of this dimension itself was deceptive enough, let alone Dormammu's own appearance. The massive head Sherlock saw, composed of countless souls or corpses devoured by Dormammu, was, according to the Ancient One, simply Dormammu's consciousness. It is a being specifically designed to devour planets and life, akin to a feeding skill. Dormammu's true form is genderless, appearing incredibly beautiful and divine, reminiscent of a biblical god. This glamorous appearance, coupled with Dormammu's deceptive claims of life extension and immortality, is enough to deceive those who scramble for immortality. Don't assume immortality is something only Earthlings pursue. You see, throughout the vast universe, every civilized species harbors those who crave immortality. Dormammu can easily gain their trust by exploiting their greed, locating their planets for consumption. After all, not every planet or civilization has a sorcerer like the Ancient One or Camartage silently protecting them. After hearing the Ancient One's explanation, Sherlock's gaze on Dormammu, who was negotiating with Stephen, suddenly grew complicated. If there were other time travelers around, they would probably recognize Sherlock's look at first glance. Isn't this the same expression Fan Wei, who had read The Art of War, had when he saw the big liar with his apprentice? Chapter 525, Everyday Things, Wanda's Busy Life. After watching the live-action film, titled The Negotiator's Birth but actually pronounced 1,000 Ways to Die for Meowing Stephen, up close, Sherlock brought the Ancient One back to his training grounds. The next day, he went to Camartage to retrieve his terrified apprentice, Wanda. Well, Wanda couldn't be blamed. After all, during Dormammu's invasion, Camartage was in turmoil, and Wanda had no idea what was happening. Sherlock went to pick up Wanda without disturbing anyone, simply leaving a note for Old Wang in the library before returning her to his training grounds. The Ancient One's arrival didn't cause any significant disruption to Sherlock's household, merely adding a gardener who enjoyed the sun. Indeed, the Ancient One took the initiative to take care of Sherlock's plants. As she put it, after a lifetime of 007 work, now was the time to cultivate her nature, walk the birds, and cultivate her garden. Of course, the person most delighted by the Ancient One's arrival was Frigga, the Queen of the Gods. After all, with the Ancient One present, Frigga's afternoon tea party finally had someone of similar age. As fellow magicians, the two shared a great deal in common, making them a perfect match for afternoon tea. Even Odin would occasionally join Frigga and the Ancient One for their afternoon tea. It must be said that compared to his days as a god king, the current Odin resembled an ordinary old man devoted to rural life. On a separate note, Sherlock, after witnessing the three of them chatting awkwardly over teacups, had the sudden inspiration to teach them a card game suitable for all ages, Landlord, Doubt Is Who. And surprisingly, for older people, this card game is an absolute stunner, even for aliens like Odin and Frigga, let alone the Ancient One. Since learning this fascinating game, the three of them have been playing it with great enthusiasm every afternoon, agreeing not to use magic or divine powers to cheat. After Sherlock taught them some variations on the game, like playing without shuffling, the trio's poker games became even more enjoyable. They played a few rounds almost every afternoon without fail, even learning to place small bets based on the odds. Of course, Sherlock had no idea what these bets were. After all, after the experiences of being lectured by his roommates before his time travel, Sherlock, a card game addict, wasn't particularly interested. In stark contrast to the trio's leisurely lifestyle was Wanda, whom Sherlock had brought back from Camartage. After letting Wanda play all day, Sherlock began to discipline her. Following the Hogwarts schedule, Sherlock assigned Wanda 6 classes: potions, charms, transfiguration, herbology, magical creatures, and defense against the dark arts. This covered every Hogwarts course Sherlock considered useful, with the only one he hadn't yet exposed Wanda to was the dark arts. After all, with a movie as a lesson, Sherlock wouldn't let Wanda learn the dark arts until he was sure she was mentally mature enough. After all, Sherlock knew from experience that the dark arts of HP could have a profound impact on the mind, and Sherlock didn't want to emulate Dumbledore's Dark Lord training program, only to then rack his brains to figure out how to deal with his own creation. To better educate Wanda, Sherlock even consulted the Ancient One about how to open up his kingdom to her. The Ancient One's answer was simple: simply brand Wanda like Dormammu. But even such a simple matter troubled Sherlock for the entire night, believing he had to come up with a good symbol to live up to the prestige of his kingdom. Shamelessly, Sherlock stole the symbol of Dumbledore's old lover, the Wiccan Party, the symbol of the Deathly Hallows, and, with a touch of wicked humor, imitated Voldemort and branded Wanda's wrist. To live up to his symbol, Sherlock even used his own exchange machine to exchange the Elder One's divinity and the Resurrection Stone. Of course, the Elder One's divinity wasn't contained within his own wand. Instead, Sherlock found a random wand and placed it there. After all, it wasn't all just for show, was it? Of course, Wanda didn't know about this. She was amazed by everything in Sherlock's divine kingdom. The magical Hogwarts made her feel like she couldn't leave. Sherlock's magical library, now integrated into Hogwarts, especially filled Wanda with excitement. No one could resist such a vast and convenient supply of magical knowledge. Of course, to ensure the health of Wanda's divinity, Sherlock made some changes. First, anything related to the dark arts, whether books or notes, was placed in the newly established restricted section. Until Wanda was proven to be immune to the negative effects of the dark arts, she wasn't allowed to enter the restricted section. However, Sherlock also granted Wanda access to purchase potions and herbs from the exchange machine. As for gold, Sherlock explained that Wanda could freely use the gold he kept in the Kingdom of God. After all, gold was worthless to Sherlock, who possessed the Philosopher's Stone. Furthermore, with the Kingdom of God's blessing, Sherlock's education of Wanda was much easier, considering the comprehensive facilities at Hogwarts. Sherlock even sometimes wondered, technically, if Wanda was the first Hogwarts student in the entire Marvel universe? That's quite remarkable. Of course, if that were all, Wanda would be far from a comparison to the Ancient One's leisurely lifestyle. After completing her education with Sherlock, Wanda would also pursue training in chaos magic from the Ancient One and Asgardian magic from Frigga. Yes, you read that correctly, Frigga took the initiative to teach Wanda the magic of Asgard. After all, Wanda's magical powers were comparable to Sherlock's, and she readily adapted to Aski's magic. Frigga, it seemed, cherished her talent. After all, Frigga's magic had virtually no successor besides Loki. Finding a perfect successor before her death was a rare opportunity for Frigga. You'd think Wanda would be fine after a long day of intense training? Turns out, that was a mistake. It's not an exaggeration to say Wanda was the busiest person in the entire training ground, as she also underwent combat and physical training at night from Sherlock's 5 uncles. All this time, Wanda was completely exhausted, wishing her 24 hours were split into 48. She often returned to her room, fell into bed, and fell asleep right after touching her pillow. Her sleep quality, wow, that's what youth is all about, falling asleep instantly. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone, see you in the next video.